back to Best Loved Films, the podcast that goes with bestlovedfilms.com. Let's begin by acknowledging that this land, the United States of America, was stewarded beautifully by hundreds of generations of Native Americans before any white people showed up. We want to thank them for that and promise to try and leave this land better. My name is Daniel Smith-Rousey. I am a sometimes filmmaker with a PhD in Film and American Studies. I've published 3 books about cinema and media. Today, I'd like to welcome to the podcast pop culture aficionado and champion, Nikole Wilson-Ripsom.
Glad to be here, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. I mean, it's a day. It's all right. It's going okay.
Well, we haven't sprung ahead quite yet, so we've still got that extra hour.
I'm ready for that extra hour myself. Yeah, I guess by the time this airs, I think that we will have that extra hour. So I guess people are listening to this going, oh, they're so stuck in the past. Well, speaking of the past, let's jump into this. We're talking today about somewhat recent past, and by that I mean the second Obama administration, which wasn't that long ago. Looking at it through 5 particular films, and I'll get into as we go how and why these films were chosen, but they are, just to head this up, Fruitvale Station, 12 Years a Slave, Selma, Tangerine, and Furious 7. Nikole, anything we should say about these films at the outset, like what it was like to go back and revisit them, or what they might have in common? Or, can we even throw anything out that's like an umbrella statement right before we even start, Nikole?
I didn't really see that much of an umbrella statement, and I actually had been thinking about, is there any common thread? And I'm sure there probably is, and that as we talk about it, we might tease it out.
Right. Yeah, okay.
Other than
that's fair.
Each of them was to me at least definitely a statement film, but in different ways.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that even a film like a weird, blockbuster like Furious 7 can make any kind of statement at all. But I think I agree with you that these films are all designed to make you think. Although I'm not sure if we're supposed to think what. I guess we'll figure that out as we go. Okay, well, let's just, is it okay if we just jump on in then, Nikole?
Let's jump on in.
Well, I will start by saying that Mr. Ryan Coogler was born in Oakland, California, a place that we know somewhat well. In 1986, after us, moved to Richmond at age 8, attended St. Mary's High School in Berkeley, and played football at St. Mary's College in Moraga, where the team was encouraged to enroll in creative writing, bringing Coogler into contact with one Rosemary Graham, who admired Coogler's sense of visuals and encouraged him to take screenplay courses. After St. Mary's disbanded its football program in 2004, Coogler transferred to and won a scholarship from Sacramento State, where he took film classes, including under Steve Buss, who recommended Coogler to Buss's alma mater, the University of Southern California, where Coogler enrolled in the MFA for Cinematic Arts. As a USC grad student, Coogler made award-winning short films and heard about the police killing of Oscar Grant. Through mutual connections, Coogler met with members of the Grant family, as well as, eventually, Forrest Whitaker, who was looking for new young filmmakers to mentor. Whitaker helped connect Coogler to the Sundance Screenwriters Lab, as well as to actor Michael B. Jordan, whom Coogler knew from The Wire and hoped to cast as Grant. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of the movie that eventually became Fruitvale Station was the tone. Was this movie going to glorify Grant, vilify Grant, or steer a kind of a tenuous middle course? As Coogler put it, quote, "I wanted the audience to get to know this guy, to get attached, so that when the situation that happens to him happens, it's not like you just read it in the paper. You know what I mean? When you know somebody as a human being, you know that life means something," unquote. Investors remained wary because there weren't a lot of films like this until The Help arrived, or more specifically, in late February 2012, Octavia Spencer won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for The Help. Spencer and Jordan met with Coogler and Whitaker and agreed to star as mother and son. And when another producer pulled out, Octavia Spencer contacted Catherine Stockett, author of the novel The Help and got her to agree to a project that might do more to help the Black community. The total budget was about $900,000. That's not much, but it's kind of a lot for a first-time feature filmmaker. Coogler reached out to the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, or BART, and their willingness to give him and his team full access was somewhat impressive considering the ongoing lawsuits related to the BART police killing of Grant. Because BART was closed every night anyway, between about 1 a.m. and 6 a.m., BART allowed Coogler to film in the exact location of Grant's murder, Fruitvale Station, for as many of those late night 4-hour windows as production could afford, which turned out to be 3. Production was also permitted to film in and around BART at other times. And Coogler's composer, Ludwig Göransson, who he went to USC with, practically turns the subway noise into a sort of a Greek chorus of mournful commentary, I would argue. Okay, so any thoughts about anything I just said, Nikole, while you were listening to that?
I did not know some of that background. I knew, I knew he was from here. I knew about the thing with Forrest Whitaker, but I did not actually know about Bart allowing him to go in there. I'd actually kind of wondered, gee, I wonder how they got that footage.
Yeah.
There. So
right. Yeah. Fruitvale Station begins in the dark with Oscar Grant and Sofina Mesa giving New Year's resolutions, smash cutting to shaky, grainy, bystander captured footage of the capture, harassment, and in a fade to black, murder of Oscar Grant. In a very modest bedroom after midnight on December 31st, 2008, Sofina and Oscar argue about his infidelity. Oscar begins talking about forever, and their kid Tatiana arrives and climbs into bed with them. Sofina asks Oscar if they're still going to Frisco for fireworks, to which Oscar says yes, drops off Sofina at her work, barely gets a bye, calls his mom, invites her out for her birthday, gets scolded about driving while on the phone, promises to pick up crabs for her birthday, goes to Farmer Joe's, chats with his homeboy at the counter, flirts with a blonde woman finding fish for a fry, puts her on with his grandma Bonnie, and begs for work from his Latino supervisor who firmly informs him the position's been filled. Oscar threatens him, walks away, lies to people that he still has his job, goes home and gets a phone call from his sister, who tells him to get a black birthday card for their mom and $300 for her rent. Oscar calls his Asian homeboy Marcus, apologizes for last night, sets up a meeting, gets gas, pets a friendly stray pit bull, texts Sofina, misses a car running over the dog, yells at the driver, cradles the canine, calls for help, and comforts the dog during its dying breaths as a BART train passes in the distance. In a flashback in San Quentin, Oscar's mom visits Oscar, shares Tatiana's brilliance, shares the girl feeling unloved while her daddy is in prison, watches Oscar verbally challenge an inmate to the point of near violence, and asks where Oscar got his scar. But when he won't answer, she announces this as her last visit and stalks off without the hug Oscar desperately wants. At a remote Bayside car park, Oscar holds his soccer ball-sized bag of weed, dumps it in the bay, meets Marcus anyway, and by way of apologizing that he no longer has the zip, lights him up with a joint that he doesn't share. Oscar picks up Sofina, invites her to live with him, invites her frustration at the car smelling like trees, and affectionately picks up Tatiana at preschool. In that modest bedroom, Oscar confesses to Sofina that he lost his job 2 weeks ago and he dumped his zip, causing Sofina's upbraiding and pleading not to make her go through this alone again. Holding a carrot cake and Tatiana, respectively, Sofina and Oscar arrive at Oscar's mom's for her big birthday celebration where women cook and men chat convivially. Oscar's mom leads the group in a handheld prayer, thanks Grandma Bonnie for her gumbo, washes dishes with Oscar, asks about his evening plans, and suggests they take BART to avoid hassles and parking. Although Oscar wants to call it a night, Sofina is determined to go out, so Oscar agrees, arrives at Sofina's sister's, hugs his sobrinos, and allays Tatiana's fears about distant gunshots with a promise of Chuck E. Cheese and the words, "I love you." Oscar and Sofina meet their friends at the South Hayward BART station, barely board an SF-bound train, watch as two of their homeboys haplessly hit on two gay women, get the whole train dancing to an impromptu amplified "Feeling Myself" by Mac Gray, and chant with the whole festive car, 3, 2, 1, Happy New Year! In downtown San Francisco, under the fireworks, Oscar sweet talks a liquor store proprietor into letting women use his closed bathroom, leading to Oscar connecting with a white web designer who long ago stole his wife's wedding ring and well got away with it. On the crowded BART train back into Oakland, of all people, the white girl doing the fish fry, Katie, calls Oscar's name, which leads to smiles until the inmate from the flashback recognizes Oscar and starts a vicious fight that stops the train at the Fruitvale station. Although Sofina leaves the station as their friends spread out, the BART police grab Oscar off the train to place him sitting on the back wall of the platform with his homies while bystanders, including Katie, cell phone film the increasingly intense insults and interactions. Oscar tries to film, is informed he'll be arrested, gets his hands cuffed behind his back, finds his face shoved into the platform, slightly resists, and ... is shot by a blonde male officer. The lead officer yells to get the train moving, shoves Katie and the other bystanders into it, calls an ambulance, and privately asks his assistant what happened, causing that guy to mumble that he thought he was firing a taser. From below the platform and out of the BART system, Sofina hears the shot, calls Oscar's mom, sees Oscar leaving the BART system on a stretcher, cries to stay with her baby's daddy, but is brusquely told Grant is being taken to Highland Hospital. There, Sofina, Oscar's mom, and several homeboys arrive, cut red tape, wait in a room, and hear from the black doctor that Oscar's stable, but bleeding internally. As Oscar's mom leads the group in prayer, the film crosscuts with the doctors working, and what may be Oscar's final thought, a magic hour memory of him piggybacking Tatiana. After the doctor comes to the waiting room to tell them Oscar didn't make it, Oscar's mom insists on seeing her baby, and does, lamenting that she had tried to keep him safe by putting him on BART, and he didn't like to be alone. Sofina picks up Tatiana, takes her into a shower, and hears, "Where's Daddy?" which cues us into intertitles about the case and its resulting protests and guilty officer released from prison after less than a year, concluding with real footage of a New Year's Day 2013 vigil attended by a downcast Tatiana Grant. So, Nikole, what do you think of this film, Fruitvale Station? What stands out to you as unique about it?
Well, this was one that, of course, we were here I was here in the Bay Area. I lived through Oscar Grant. So, this was one of those films, the historical biopic sort of. So I'm always a little bit leery of films like that.
Yes.
Because I'm always wondering how's it going to really capture. And the thing that you had said about was Coogler going to present Oscar Grant sympathetically or negatively, or tries for that tenuous middle ground? And when I got done watching it, my first thought was, so more than anything, this film was about making Oscar Grant human.
Yes. Yes. Agreed.
And so that was really what I came away from. I was like, okay, the thing of it, and I understand in a broader societal sense the benefit of that.
Yeah.
But I came at it from the perspective of we should never have had to do that to begin with.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's what for me was always underlying as I was watching this movie. Is I was like, there shouldn't have been a struggle to make Oscar Grant be seen as human. He shouldn't have been shot down like a dog in the BART station. End of story.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
That said, I thought that Michael B. Jordan was amazing casting.
Yeah, really
I thought that he really, and funny enough, the element of it for me more than anything was the smile. because the most well-known photo that gets that was of Oscar Grant is of that great smile.
Yep.
And Michael B. Jordan had that smile.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing for me, and I don't know, it may not have been the case for other people, but being a Bay Area resident, to me, the Bay Area was absolutely an actor in the film.
I know what you mean. Yeah. And certainly Bart. Bart was like a supporting character or something. Yeah. Right. Especially the sort of the African American side of the Bay Area. Like just when they're in the BART train, like, dancing to the Mac Dre song or whatever.
Oh, that's a whole thing. New Year's Eve on the BART. That I was like, oh my God, that was a whole thing.
Right.
But from him sitting at the water, when he's sitting there at the edge of the bay.
Sure.
And for me, that really, in many ways, tied back to San Quentin, because if you know where San Quentin is, that they're locked in these cages at the water's edge, but they can't see the water.
Isn't that something? Right? And that's when that flashback takes place. It's that exact moment, right? So sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
So that he chooses that his place of Zen and of committing to his new lifestyle is the water that he couldn't see when he was in San Quentin.
Yeah.
To me was actually a really powerful choice that I don't know if Coogler made it deliberately. I'm sure he probably did, but at least for me, that was how it resonated. And then the other thing that stood out for me in terms of the Bay Area as a character, of course, there's the shot at New Year's of the fireworks going off over the bay.
That, well, we've all seen that. Yeah, right.
But when he goes to his mom's house, and this, because I spent years as a real estate inspector in the Bay Area, so I drove all over. So when we see the Calaroga sign, I was immediately like, Hayward, he's in Hayward.
Yeah. I know. They were actually true to Hayward more than you might expect. I mean, they get in on the South Hayward BART station. I mean, and he's like, I'll meet you in Hayward. Don't worry, I'll be right there. That's like the last thing he says to Sofina, right? I mean, like, I was actually sort of impressed that they kept Hayward in the mix, like, in a good way,
And I think though that that's also part of being true to the Oakland community, and especially the Black Oakland community. There are a lot of ties to Hayward and Union City, as well as Richmond. These are interconnected. I also love that Farmer Joe's was part of it.
Oh my God, but that's right at the Fruitvale Street. And like when you get off the freeway, it's right there. I know, just seeing it, I was like, yes.
So was I. I was like, Farmer Joe's. Oh my God, that's so cool.
Right.
So, like I said, and of course, these are things that might not resonate with people who are not familiar with the Bay Area. But for those of us here, like I said, for me, that made the Bay Area its own character in the film.
And maybe you needed a local really to get some of this right. I'm not sure that if, like, say, Spike Lee had made this film, I'm not sure you'd have all that local nuance. I mean, I'm sure he'd make a fine film, but there's a way in which, you almost need a local. I don't know. I mean, that's something I'm thinking about. Go ahead. Sorry.
And as much as I love Octavia Spencer.
Yes.
I don't know that I would have chosen her to play his mom. I think she did a perfectly good job. I just don't know that she would have been my choice.
Right.
The actress who played Sofina, I loved her. I thought she was wonderful. And this was another case of really being true that she works at, because when I saw the uniform at first, I was like, I know what store that's from. And it wasn't until we see him pick her up, I'm like, Food Bats. She works at Food Bats.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. Yeah. And she got the carrot cake from there, which is, normal. You would, But yeah.
So
no,
there were all these great bits of reality in there. Yeah, as you pointed out, that she got the carrot cake from there.
For me, one of the great values of this film is that it's about people who are kind of ordinary people like Oscar and Tatiana, who are just workaday people who just have like regular jobs, or in Oscar's case, don't have a job. But I mean, we don't have a million movies about that. Usually, if it's a movie, it's about somebody sort of exceptional for some reason. It's about a crime, or the next movie we're going to talk about is about a slave who was, 12 years. I mean, that's a very unusual situation, right? So and then obviously Dr. King. I mean, what I'm saying is I love this movie. Well, you're right to say we shouldn't have had to have made this movie, but having had to make it, or I mean, I love that. I guess I love seeing a guy that we don't usually see centralized in a drama. A guy that we would know from just kind of hanging out uh, and talking the way that he does. Just talk like a normal. I mean,
Yeah.
I think outside of a movie like Friday, where it's like comic or whatever, we don't usually see these guys in the middle of a movie. I mean, and that I love that that's part of it. I love that, that to me is kind of valuable anyway. It's too bad that it also comes with what it comes with, but it's like, but I loved having that. Anyway, sorry.
That that was definitely, yeah, those everyday things. One of the things that I loved, like when he's talking to his mom and she's like, "Are you using that headset I gave you?" And he's like, "Okay, I'm just gonna put my phone up under my hat."
Right. And by the way,
And
that
I'm like,
was
okay, I've seen people do that.
that was so 2008, 2009, because everybody was like driving around with their cell phones and nobody, and this was, I love that he had like a flip phone
The
that,
flip
you had
phone.
to program through. Yeah. And I also, this was like the first time I had seen a film where the text messages routinely appeared kind of on the screen as they, now, maybe some filmmaker had done that device before, but I honestly hadn't really seen it. Now it's standard. Now you
Yeah.
just see the text messages, but in like 2011, 2012, I hadn't seen a movie where like the character texts and then you just see what they're texting kind of written on the screen. I thought that was actually innovative of Coogler. I feel like I don't know if he invented it, but I think if he didn't invent it, he was one of the first people to do it. He didn't have a lot of guidance for how to do it. So
Yeah.
I like that too. And I just like him scrolling through the old flip phone and like to get his friend Marcus, he has to go through like Malcolm, Manny, Mark,
Yes.
that's like bringing me back to 2009,
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, those little that was those little things like that, but also those set the movie very definitely in a moment in time.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely. It really does, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, and that's so important because that's what in many ways the movie's almost about is like obviously black people have been suffering police brutality for centuries, but this camera phone ubiquity thing is new. And that's kind of, in some ways, that's what Oscar Grant's death kind of represented in a way.
yeah.
I think he was, if he wasn't the first famous person to have his, to be killed by a cop and mostly filmed by a bunch of camera phones. If he wasn't the first, he had to be one of the first. He had to be one of the first people to sort of one of the first victims to become very famous that way. I mean, I don't remember another one that I knew about. So I think that I feel like that's part of the significance of Oscar Grant's death. He kind of pivoted us toward this new era of the 2010s, kind of. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a way in which that pointed the way to which way things would go from there. That actually reminds me of a question I was going to ask you. Did Coogler almost didn't include the actual cell phone footage? He sort of thought,
Oh,
do I want to include that?
that
But
would have been a shame.
right.
The book ending of the film with starting and ending with the actual footage.
I think that was so. You agree with me that that was a good creative choice?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I
yeah,
think
I think so too.
it definitely made the film more powerful, I think, to start to uh, and and to me it also helps build the dramatic tension because you know what's going to by using
Yeah,
that footage in the very beginning, you know how the movie's ending.
yeah,
You know the trauma that's coming.
that's right. And lots of movies do that. They start with that. They start you with something that's gonna happen an hour in. And so
Yeah.
yeah. But I think it totally works, and it helps situate Oscar Grant as an important story for people who don't know about it. I think that's
Yeah.
also important because I'm sure there must be people watching this film who've never heard of him. So it's like, why are you asking me to watch a movie about this guy?
Yeah.
I think it also helps. Let me ask you about another thing, Nikole, which you sort of mentioned or I thought of this question when you were talking about the Oscar being at the edge of the Bay Area and, throwing out his zip bag of weed while he was thinking, while the movie was also flashing back on San Quentin. So this movie did take some creative licenses. Okay. For example, December 31st is not the birthday of Oscar Grant's mother. The names of the white BART police officers were altered, even though Oscar Grant's name was obviously not. possibly the reason for that was to curtail lawsuits from their families. I think that's why. Um, it's not known that Oscar Grant threw out a zip bag of weed on the last day of his life. We don't know that. But what I guess I'm wondering what you think of those creative, like, is a movie like this allowed to make some creative choices to change things? Like, does it matter? Because I'm kind of setting up our next two movies, because with 12 Years a Slave and Selma, there was actually a lot more controversy over whether events had been accurately represented. And in the case of Fruitvale Station, it's actually really interesting to me. There wasn't much there wasn't a whole slew of internet attacks against like the accuracy. But I actually think, Nikole, and I mean, at least this is just my speculation, if they were to make a movie today about George Floyd and they were to change the facts of his life,
Lord, the outcry would be enormous.
I suspect there would have been a major outcry. I think it was because people just weren't, the internet would go crazy. And I think but it's interesting that in 2013, I think this was just considered a sort of a small film, and so people didn't really feel like they needed to attack it. But what is your thought?
This gets into that the when you see films that are based on actual events,
yes.
And I've always felt like that's an important tag.
Yeah,
based on actual events.
Yeah.
That does not mean that it is a 100% accurate depiction of actual events.
Sure. Right.
And so I feel like when a filmmaker says that this movie is based on actual events, to me, I go in expecting that there's going to be a little bit of creative license. Taken.
Okay. Me too. Go ahead.
I assumed, I don't know for 100% certain, perhaps you do, that the full circle come around that Fish Fry Girl is on BART filming. I assumed that was not true. I assumed that was something that Ryan Coogler thought was a nice full circle moment, but I was like, the odds of that happening are just astronomical. So, not that it couldn't happen. No, I just didn't think it did.
I think an intelligent audience like you and me, but maybe this includes everybody, doesn't worry about that. Thinks, okay, that's dramatic license. We don't need to, maybe it's not the same person, but who cares? That's not what's important here. Now, we know that Coogler's not going to make a huge mistake about like the cops shooting him and then claiming that he reached for his taser. We know Coogler's not going to just make up that moment. That's not going to be like, oh, he really thought he was reaching for his, I don't know what, pepper spray. I mean, they're gonna get the important parts right. I think the rest at least for me, I realize a character like Katie that you just mentioned is obviously a dramatic conceit, and it's fine. At least for me, it's fine. But I can see how some people might have, whatever. Interesting to me that people didn't care so much about this, but then they did care about the next two films. I think only because they didn't even really realize this film was out. I mean, or whatever. I mean, of course it was a small film. It reads like an independent film, and those don't get attacked.
But the specific scene of him throwing out the weed, I that's another one where I did not honestly think that he sat and threw it. When I saw that, I thought, and actually for me, what I thought in that scene at the time was, what a creative way of visually showing his commitment to a new lifestyle. Instead of having it be, a conversation between he and his mom, or he and Sofina, or
right.
Instead of it being verbal, it was an act that he took and I felt like that actually made it more impactful.
I like the way you say that. I've now seen this movie so many times because I used to show it for classes. Well, I still sometimes do. So I don't know, this revisiting it just now was like the 20th time. To me, I realize it's almost like it's two movies, two 40-minute movies. One is like him deciding to be a better person and deciding to listen to her advice about Oprah, which she gives him like early in the thing. And then the second movie is, the horrible events, basically. So I mean, I think they both work, and I just think this movie always impresses me. It doesn't waste time. It doesn't waste words. It's powerful. Anything else about it that you'd like to say?
No, it was good to go back and rewatch it.
Yeah.
And and of course then Ryan Coogler went on to do Black Panther. So.
Right. One or two people may have heard about that film. Yeah. I wanted to, well, let me just throw out a little history that might, just to see if this prompts anything else from either of us. So Fruitvale Station, under its original title, Fruitvale, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2013, January, where it won a grand jury prize and an audience award. In May 2013 at the Cannes Film Festival, it won the Camera d'Or, which is that festival's award for first-time filmmakers. It's pretty impressive. The Weinstein Company released the film in select theaters in the United States. I know, well, we don't like them anymore, but that is what happened. At the time, every independent filmmaker was hoping that the Weinstein Company would release their films. At the time, that was a feather in his cap to, in Coogler's cap to even get them, so that was good. But this is important. They released it on July 12th, 2013, where afterward it became a modest indie hit. One day after the film's release, on July 13, George Zimmerman was acquitted of his slaying of Trayvon Martin. And in response, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi went forward with their plans to promote the phrase Black Lives Matter as a hashtag, a slogan, and if possible, a decentralized organizing principle that could carry the work of the civil rights movements into the 21st century. Now, I want to say quickly, Nikole, BLM definitely would have become BLM without Fruitvale Station. If that movie had never been made, BLM still would have existed. However, because absolutely no studio or TV network has made or is planning to make a non-documentary film about the real life of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, or 100 other Black persons famously slain by police in the last decade, Fruitvale Station stands as the kind of unofficial non-documentary film of the BLM movement. Other than Fruitvale Station's exceptional quality, its kind of unofficial BLM representation is why I had to put Fruitvale Station on this C list. Anyway, any thoughts about anything I just said?
It's funny when you were going through the names, and I always thought Sandra Bland's story would have made a really good movie.
I would love. Oh, you're saying would have. I don't think we should rule that out. I mean, I would be loving that. However, I can't help but notice that in a time of like 500 channels and this overwhelming need for streaming content, somehow they still don't feel like making another Fruitvale Station or a comparable film, that just isn't on anybody's radar, despite the glaring need for much more content. I mean, I think there's a couple documentaries, but there's nothing like this. A documentary is not the same as what Ryan Coogler did here, obviously. It's not a feeling of the interior life of Oscar Grant, you know what I mean? So yeah, I would love a Sandra Bland. I mean, there's all kinds of people, but unfortunately there are no plans. So maybe let's hope somebody listens to this podcast and decides.
and for that matter, for all we know, there could well be some young person out there,
right,
with an iPhone who has done something.
That's true.
And is out there desperately searching for money to make it.
Sure, you might be right. We just, as far as I know, I mean, this is what I've heard. Now, you're right. I'm supposed to be an expert on this, but there might be something I haven't heard about. So who knows? Please comment.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, like in so much in life, there's always an element of luck. And Ryan Coogler definitely had luck on his side in meeting the right people at the right moment in time.
I mean, in a way, I hate to say it, but it was kind of good that he was from Oakland, I mean, of course, he never would have wanted Oscar Grant to die. That is obviously not something he wanted. But in a way, it did help him that he could bring this local approach, because he could go to Coogler's family and say, I'm from here, I'm not going to disrespect you, I mean, in a way that another filmmaker might not have been able to do, right? So, yeah.
And that's, I think, is important. And so that's why I was thinking, maybe there is somebody in Texas like that. But
sure.
Yeah, I do think that his being local was very central to getting that perspective. And it ties back, like I said, to making the Bay Area its own character.
Yep. there's definitely an element of luck to life for sure. And we're lucky. I feel like we're lucky that Coogler had the career has had. I mean, he's gone on to this career where every single one of his films is about African Americans. I mean, that's kind of unusual. You know,
Yeah.
you have somebody more like a, let's say, a Lee Daniels or Spike Lee, where some of their films are about white people, and that you almost have to be to succeed in Hollywood, you know. But
Yeah.
now, but Coogler, if he wanted, he could continue only making movies, you know, about underrepresented African Americans in Africa. I mean, that would be interesting. I'm not saying he has to do that, but I'm saying
Yeah.
it's
But he
fascinating to me
could.
if he could, if he wanted, you know. Okay, well, how about we move on to the next thing? We've covered this one. We've knocked this one out of the park, Nikole. Before the founding of Black Lives Matter, the chair of Harvard University's African American Studies Department, Henry Louis Gates Jr., experienced racial profiling from a white policeman who arrested and cuffed him for trying to jimmy open his own home's locked door. Afterwards, Gates attended President Obama's famous beer summit, continued with his PBS produced projects, and received a call from a British director named Steve McQueen asking him to consult on a new film project about slavery. Steve McQueen's parents emigrated to London from Grenada and Trinidad and may not have heard of the white American movie star when they named their new baby Steve McQueen in 1969. Not clear. British schools moved McQueen into a remedial track because of his black skin and his lazy eye, but McQueen overcame these challenges to excel at 3 different art schools in London before briefly attending New York University, which he saw as insufficiently experimental, saying, quote, "They wouldn't let you throw the camera up in the air," unquote. I love that quote. I think that's a great one.
So that's a problem.
Yeah, well, I love that. I mean, you know, he's got a different approach than Coogler, and that's totally fine. McQueen's first reviewed work was Bear, in which 2 naked men, one being McQueen, exchanged glances that could be flirts or threats. McQueen's work found its way into several museums throughout the 1990s, culminating in the Turner Prize in Britain in 1999. Eventually, he traveled to Iraq as an official war artist, which resulted in his project that cast the faces of slain soldiers into British stamps. 2008 saw McQueen's first feature film, Hunger, about the 1981 Irish hunger strike, winning many major honors, including McQueen becoming the first Brit to win the Camera d'Or. I just mentioned that award in the context of Coogler. After that, even as he prepped his next film, Shame, McQueen also got into contact with an American novelist, screenwriter, director, showrunner, and NPR blogger named John Ridley. The African American Ridley's work had theretofore focused on the 20th century experiences of African Americans from World War II to the Blaxploitation era to the First Iraq War. But Ridley and McQueen shared a desire to tell some kind of unconventional slave narrative. However, the notion remained stuck until McQueen's partner, Bianca Stigter, found Solomon Northup's 1853 memoir, 12 Years a Slave. For McQueen, who was a resident of Amsterdam by then, Northup's words reminded him of Anne Frank's firsthand accounts, but written during a different Holocaust from a century before. However, the notion remained stuck again because of uninterested studios until April 2011, when Quentin Tarantino submitted his script for Django Unchained to Harvey Weinstein, who we just mentioned, who committed something like $100 million to Tarantino if he could get both Leonardo DiCaprio and an A-list black star. Brad Pitt, star of Inglourious Bastards, kept up with his friend Quentin and figured to leverage Weinstein's Django budget into at least a fraction of it for 12 Years a Slave. So Pitt and Dee Dee Gardner's production company, which is called Plan B, bought the rights to McQueen's film and brought other shingles on board to bring the budget up to about $22 million. Now, that budget might have increased, Nikole, if McQueen, like Tarantino, found an A-list star to play Solomon Northup. However, McQueen well knew of Chiwetel Ejiofor from his supporting work in many 2000s films, and he told the press, this is McQueen, quote, Chiwetel Ejiofor was always going to be Solomon Northup for me. I was looking for someone that had that genteelness, that kind of humanity, unquote. Well, okay, if he says so. Production hired not just Henry Louis Gates, but also several other experts on antebellum slavery, resulting in a film that was mostly lauded for its historical accuracy. Most of the filming was done around New Orleans, making particular use of 4 historical plantations in the area. Early on, McQueen and cinematographer Sean Bobbitt decided to use 35 millimeter film and a 2 to 2.35 to 1 ratio, which is also known as widescreen, eschewing any kind of gritty documentary-ish look for more of an epic feel. They didn't want this movie to look like a movie like Fruitvale Station. Why? Well, McQueen compared the film to Goya's paintings, which were beautiful because they were horrible, or perhaps vice versa. Some of the costumes had been worn by slaves. Some of the scenes were shot less than a mile from where the depicted events took place. 12 Years a Slave begins with rituals of slave life on an antebellum plantation that come to a nighttime focus on the shanty of one slave, Solomon Northup, discreetly allowing a white woman to mount him, even as he looks blankly at her while flashing back on an intimate moment with his black wife. In Saratoga, New York, in 1841, Solomon wears fine livery, tunes a violin, plays it to a rapturous audience, strolls through a park, and gets hailed by an acquaintance who introduces him to a duo who offer him considerable compensation for every night he plays violin with their troupe on their way to Washington, where he'll make even more money. In Washington, in complex cuts, we see Solomon happily toasting his 2 benefactors, awakening in chains, puking, getting accompanied to bed, and being informed that no, he has no free family in Saratoga, but is instead a runaway slave from Georgia. As Solomon is carried from a DC cell to a wagon to the bowels of a steamship, a fellow slave, Clemens, advises Solomon that his exalted fellow artists aren't coming to help him, and that he shouldn't admit his identity or ability to read and write if he wants to survive, prompting Solomon to say, quote, "I don't want to survive. I want to live," unquote. As Solomon lands on a southern auction block, he flashes back to shopping with his wife in a Saratoga dry goods store run by an obsequious Mr. Parker, where a random black man staggered in, stared at Solomon, and was summarily strong-armed out by his white master. During the auctioneer commands slaves to stand at their name, slaps Solomon for failing to stand at plat, negotiates with buyers, and refuses to let one buyer, William Ford, get a girl for free. And so Ford buys Platt and the girl's mother, Eliza, who screams and hollers and cries all the way. During the auction, the auctioneer commands slaves to stand at their name, slaps Solomon for failing to stand at plat, negotiates with buyers, and refuses to let one of them, William Ford, get a girl for free. And so Ford buys Solomon and the girl's mother, Eliza, who screams and hollers and cries at the loss of her children, all the way to Ford's plantation, where Ford's overseer, John, maliciously instructs the slaves and capriciously sings, "Run, Jigga, run, the batter will get you, run, Jigga, run, you better get away." He doesn't say jigger, he says a word that rhymes with that. As the slaves perform several painful projects and procedures until they happen upon some Native Americans who party with them. By a waterway to John's racist skepticism, Solomon suggests to Ford a certain sort of construction, cites his engineering and hiring experience in the Erie Canal, receives Ford's impressment and approval, and completes the job, for which Ford gives him a new violin. At slave quarters, Eliza whimpers and simpers over her lost children and chides Solomon for his lack of emotion and sycophancy toward Ford, but Solomon's stoicism seems smart when whites drag Eliza screaming off of the plantation. As Solomon builds structure, John reproves his technique, demands the impossible, gets refused, orders Solomon to strip, and finds himself fighting and feeling Solomon's whip on his own back. That's the white guy getting whipped. Soon, John returns with 2 white field hands who help him hang Solomon from a thick willow branch until a higher-ranking overseer arrives, cites Ford's debts, runs them off, calls for Ford, but doesn't free Solomon, who dangles with his feet barely touching the earth for exactly 4 excruciating film minutes, until Ford arrives and cuts him down. In Ford's mansion, Ford holds a rifle, guards the door, and explains to Solomon that because of John, Ford had to sell him to the allegedly evil Edwin Epps. So Solomon beseeches Ford to see he's not a slave, only to feel Ford's frustration that he's trying to save his life. On Epps's plantation, Epps reads scripture that contrasts from Ford's readings in its ginned up justifications for hundreds of slave lashings. After a long day picking cotton, Epps reviews the day's hauls, scolds Solomon for his low weight, and luxuriates, that's his word, in the plentiful poundage procured by Patsy, whom we see inside Epps's mansion with the other slaves dancing to Solomon's fiddling, and Epps is smiling until Mary Epps brains Patsy with a bottle and demands a sale of Patsy that her husband absolutely refuses. When Mary sends Solomon off with a shopping list, Solomon claims not to know how to read it, walks off trail, and finds whites hanging blacks who tell him to continue and as ordered, which he does, shuddering. On a Sabbath day, Solomon breathlessly arrives at an estate where a black woman named Harriet Shaw insists that Solomon remain for porch poured tea, as she explains to Solomon and Patsy how being her white master's regular mistress is a small price to pay for living decades without lashes and field work. At Epps's plantation, Solomon tells Epps he brought back Patsy as ordered, but Epps calls Solomon a liar, chases him around the pig pen, and almost kills him, until Mary intervenes to shame Edwin Epps for his lust for Patsy, even on the Sabbath. By moonlight, Edwin is close to raping Patsy, but her indifference earns Edwin's slap and a turn away. On another night of dancing, Mary distributes her home-cooked treats to everyone but Patsy, hits her, and admonishes her husband that his mercies will have these jiggers, killing them in their sleep. She didn't say jigger. You could just keep assuming that every time I say jigger. Late at night in slave quarters, we finally hear Patsy's voice as it implores Solomon to kill her, but Solomon refuses the sin. In concupiscent close-ups, Cottonworm comes to Epps's cotton, causing Epps to send a half-dozen slaves to one Judge Turner, who hears Solomon's fiddle playing and sends him to play music at a neighbor's celebration and keep whatever tuppence he earns. With the cottonworm gone, that group of slaves returns to the hard work at Epps's plantation, where Solomon meets a white named Armsby, whose private confession of his drunk journey from overseer to field hand prompts Solomon's explanation of his own situation and his proposal that he pay his pennies to Armsby to take his letter to the town post office. At night, after we see Solomon scribing, a drunk Epps brings a knife to Solomon's throat and confronts him with the scheme, only to have Solomon somehow convince Epps that Armsby invented the story in order to become an overseer. A Canadian named Samuel Bass calls on Epps, constructs part of a shanty for him, and castigates Epps for his treatment of slaves. When Patsy arrives after a prolonged absence, Epps refuses to accept her explanation that she only went to Shaw's for the soap that Mary refuses her. And so Epps ties Patsy to a whipping post and forces Solomon to whip her with increasing ferocity, or he will shoot every jigger in sight. Later, Patsy's recovery includes a close-up of perhaps the most torn up back ever put on film. Working on the shanty, Solomon decides to confide his story in Bass, who confesses his own fear for Solomon and himself, but consents to mail his letter to New York. After an existentially long close-up of a forlorn Solomon, Mr. Parker arrives with a sheriff whose questions permit Solomon to affirm what only he would know of his wife and children, and the sheriff and Parker push away an enraged, epithet-spewing Epps as they hasten to place Solomon in a wagon to freedom, though Solomon does take a moment to hug Patsy goodbye. Back in Saratoga, Solomon enters his home, trembles, and apologizes to his family, including his adult children, his son-in-law, and grandson, Solomon Northup Staunton. Title cards describe Solomon's unsuccessful suits against his captors, his more successful work as an abolitionist, and the mystery surrounding his death. Okay, Nikole, I have white-splained this movie to death now. What did you think of 12 Years a Slave? What stands out about it for you?
So I have a person coming into the movie. I was digging through old college stuff to see,
Yeah.
because I was an African American literature minor,
Okay.
and or major, and
Either one. Go
either
ahead.
one. We read a lot of slave narratives,
Yeah.
and so I could never quite figure out if Solomon Northrup's was one of the ones that we read. If not,
Okay.
we read one very similar. I'm pretty sure it was Solomon Northrop. So the story itself, when I was like, I remember reading that in college. So
Yeah.
this isn't new. Um,
Go ahead.
and then, to put it on the screen, there was just, I don't know. I think maybe if they'd gone for the grittier look, it would have felt better to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But the big epic look of it, and I look back at this movie, and I every time my first thought is the best thing about that movie was Brad Pitt. And I never want to have to say that about any movie.
He's only in it for like 10 minutes or so.
I know.
But go ahead, yeah.
And I especially when you've got a movie with Lupita Nyong'o in it, whom I just adore.
She's great in this. Yeah, go ahead.
And she is, but just there was, and I think there was just, as I watched it, I was just like, oh, this is it. It's almost like it. I did not know that quote that you were saying before about him and Goya's paintings, and so that actually is like ruminating in my head now. I'm like, that's an interesting way of looking at it. That perhaps by treating this horrible thing beautifully, but I think at the same time, that's what really kind of irked me about the film.
No, that's fair. I definitely think they were going for this kind of epic, and I think that that's controversial, and it should be, because it's like, I think of that 4-minute shot, 4 minutes, 4 excruciating minutes of, Solomon dangling from that tree, and it's so beautiful looking. I mean, I hate to say that, but you know what I mean? Like, it's so well composed. The willow branch, the slaves walking by and like ignoring him. I mean, it looks like a painting. It looks like a horrible, horrible painting come to life. And yeah, I mean, they could have filmed that much more Fruitvale Station-ishly. They could have filmed it much more and they chose not to. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, those 4 minutes are some of the 4 most painful minutes for me of any film. I mean, watching that, waiting for somebody to cut him down or something.
Yeah.
I don't know how to feel about that even. I mean, I know
and so those 4 minutes to me also, they encapsulated what I've read and heard people refer to as slavery porn. I was like, those 4 minutes were like 3 minutes too long.
Yeah.
That you could have conveyed that in 60 seconds.
Yep.
And not done, so that's, and that kind of thing, it is what throughout the movie, I was like, this movie, it like I said, slavery porn is the term that I've heard, and that resonated with me.
Right. I do think that the choice of all these kind of tableaus that they hang on for like a long time, that's actually thematic. I mean,
I'm supposed to make you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's supposed to.
It's funny, not funny, but like at the time I wrote a piece, a column that appeared in the largest independent Oscar watching site, which is called Awards Daily. But so the title of my piece was "The Unbearable Stillness of Being a Slave." And I was, just talking about all those frozen tableaus. Like it starts with one. You see those slaves, like just like it almost looks like they're caught in a painting. And there's a bunch of them throughout the film. There's that really important one. Even after Brad Pitt has made his final appearance on screen, or I should say just after, you have this long close-up of Ejiofor, just sort of like in this existential kind of forlorn. There's so many of those. And I really think, and the case I made in my piece is that this is McQueen's way of saying that at the time, slavery felt like something that had always been and would always be. There was no, don't fool yourself
Yeah.
into thinking that in 1850 people were saying to themselves, oh, well, 10 years from now, slavery will be over and we'll just, there was no way to know that. This felt like a permanent condition. And I feel like the way it's filmed, there's no birds. Like there's so many of these outdoor scenes. You don't hear birds in any of these outdoor scenes. In other words, like whereas like that's unusual. Most times when filmmakers go outside, you hear birds, you hear cricket, you hear that.
You hear the sounds of being out.
Yeah, they don't do that, and I think that's a total choice to make it seem like we are stuck in amber, here in the 1840s, and I think. I don't know, at least for me. So, I mean, the reason I wanted to write that piece, actually, I was reacting in the middle of the Oscar race to a lot of even the people who like the film were kind of supporting it against, or their reason for why voters should vote for it was because, like, we owed it to Black people or something. Like, white Academy voters needed to put up and shut up, and they owed it to Black history and Black people. But I thought that was a terrible argument for why it should win Best Picture. I think that's to say that they owed it was not, to me, convincing. To me, a more convincing case is just what was McQueen doing? What was his sort of virtuosity in making the film? And so that's my piece entirely only talked about that. And it's interesting. The site's editor, Sasha Stone, she republished it like 2 days before final voting. I noticed that after it had been published like a month earlier, and I thought, who knows? Maybe we helped. Because I know these voters read her site, so who knows? Maybe we helped in some small way to make that film become the first Black directed film to win the Best Picture Oscar, which is one of its distinctions. But I don't know. Yeah. Any thoughts about anything I just said?
No, that's actually really interesting. I was not aware of that. The other thing that as I was thinking about it, I'm like the cinema. A lot of the cinematography in the movie was really amazing.
Right.
So I do have to give it that.
Well, that maybe almost, but from what I'm hearing you say, a little too amazing, maybe. Yeah. I mean, no, he's got those close-ups of the cotton worm are just gorgeous.
Gorgeous, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you could see that this is a guy who had made films, who clearly knew what he was doing with a camera for quite a while.
And it's an important story, and I think it was a good story to tell. It was just, I didn't necessarily agree with a lot of the choices in how to tell it.
Right. When I hear the word slavery porn, it makes me think there's like 50 films about slavery, but there really aren't, like it's not that common that Americans are being asked to go to movies like this. I mean,
it's more about the exploitative lens of it.
Yes. No, I see that.
And that's a difficult line to walk between how do you show the suffering without delving into almost, enjoyment of the suffering. Kind of like with the previous one where we were talking about how do you walk that fine line between showing Oscar Grant as a human, a complex human who could save a dog and jump up and cheat on his girlfriend. And so it's that similar thing here. How do you show the horrors, but also, and then what a lot of these movies lack as well is why is there not an equally long lens on the joy?
Thank you. Right. And that was a very tricky thing to do. Right. And there were occasional, but that was very hard to do, I think. I like that scene where they're singing late in the film, and then Solomon does join in. I mean, allowing him some, but I know what you mean, some joy. It's interesting what you said about showing suffering. Like I noticed in my research that Brad Pitt, once they'd committed it, but they wanted to get other people on board, they needed more people to commit, more money. Two films that they referenced when they were trying to pitch to others were Schindler's List and The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's film, because they were like, those are films that show the central character suffering, but also, and there's a way in which those films are like eating spinach for audiences. It's like, here's something really hard that happened, and yet they made a bunch of money. So in other words, people can go to movies like that. And by the way, they did in this case. I mean, it was a hit. I'm not calling it, no, but they weren't sure if it would be. This was a hit.
No, I absolutely could see them being really uncertain about it.
Sure. Oh yeah, this could have been a movie that didn't make any money. It really could have been. It got rapturous reviews mostly. Well, that seems like the time to mention that despite or because of the authority of Henry Louis Gates, critics took issue with McQueen and Ridley's creative license. One critic said that Northup's book presented William Ford as a much nicer person. The Cumberbatch character? I read that and I'm like, how much nicer was he supposed to be? I mean, they made him nice. What are we supposed to what's Northup supposed to fall at his feet? I mean, give me a break. And then I read that. And then I just saw that there was another critic who said that the slave ship incident where the one guy stops a sort of a possible rape, that doesn't actually happen in Northup's memoir. So what? I mean, well, okay, I don't know. Well, that's my question to you, basically. Before I ask it, one last sentence. There's a blog called Information is Beautiful, which gives itself the authority to atomize awards bait historical films for their accuracies and inaccuracies. It like tracks minutely scene by scene by scene. This blog decided that 12 Years a Slave was 88.1% accurate. Let me ask you, Nikole, does it matter? Did they need to get the other 12% right? I mean, you tell me.
So again, here we go, based on actual events, based on Northrup's journal.
Noir.
You've got there's going to be some creative license. No one writes down every minute detail of their life in their journal, and especially not slaves in the 1800s. So we were going to have to fill it in.
Yes.
And filling it in with stories from other writings of the time.
Yes.
So while that the incident may not have happened to Northrop, it happened.
Right.
It wasn't created whole cloth out of nothing.
No.
So and it's funny because at the time I was like, no, I remember reading that too. It's just it was somebody else's memoir.
Right.
Yeah. And now the interesting thing, of course, would be, and this is where I have to stop and like examine my own biases, and perhaps Steve McQueen not being American, he may well have read other slave memoirs and known about it. If he were some other filmmaker, some other non-African American filmmaker, I might be more inclined to say maybe he just made that up.
Right.
But again, not being American, I almost feel like he was probably more deeply invested in actually researching what he was going to put in his film.
Sure. Yeah. Well, funny you should say that, because I remember last podcast I quoted Quentin Tarantino as saying that, like, Europeans don't make movies like the one I want to make, Django Unchained, because they don't feel like they can. They don't feel like they can presume. Now, he said this before. He was saying this in like 2008 when he was starting to develop these. Like, they don't feel like they can have the authority to talk about American slavery. And he's like, I don't even know why American filmmakers don't do it, because we're just twisted up in knots. Now he's justifying Django Unchained, which is a fascinating film that obviously came out a year before and got lots of flack for its inaccuracies. Now, I don't know that movie's even trying to be accurate. I mean, there was a black critic who said, these slaves are walking around these plantations like they're in Versailles. Like they're just, like they're like you could, like it's like tea and crumpets. No, like give me a break, And compared to that, a lot of people felt that 12 Years a Slave got a lot more things right. Just the feelings of the antebellum slavery, the crack of the whip, the feeling of what it would have been like to actually be at the plantation. I mean, they would say, they would actually ask Henry Gates, which one is more accurate. He said, look, obviously I consulted on 12 Years a Slave, but I actually like his perspective. He's like, it's great that we have both of these films. You know what? Because it's good that they're here. We can talk about it more. I'm not, let's talk about other slave narratives too, but for
Yeah.
him, it's like, it's fine for us to argue about these accuracies and things. Let's just, but at least we have the film so that we're talking about it. And I think that's the right perspective. Other final thoughts about this before I segue to my next thing?
No, I think I'm done on this one.
One reason for the success of 12 Years a Slave was its very effective soundtrack, which featured 2 songs written and performed by John Legend. After Legend finished his work on that film, he turned his attention to his album, Love in the Future. And after that, to co-writing a song that would win him an Oscar called Glory. Not everyone realizes that 12 Years a Slave's Best Picture win earned producers Brad Pitt and Dee Dee Gardner their first Oscars, even as they were getting ready for principal photography for the first ever theatrical film centralizing Mr. Martin Luther King Jr. Did I say Mr.? I meant Dr. King. Pitt and Gardner had optioned Paul Webb's script about the relationship between Dr. King and Lyndon Johnson all the way back in spring 2008, before Barack Obama had even become the Democratic nominee for president. In contrast to the practices of some of their friends, Brad Pitt and Dee Dee Gardner felt they needed an African-American director for White Webb's story of an African-American king. Around the time of the release of Precious in late 2009, Lee Daniels almost took on Webb's script, but he later said he had to choose between that and The Butler, and so chose the latter. The Forrest Gump-ish The Butler, by the way, have you seen that movie, Nikole?
Yeah.
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 It was on some of the earlier versions of this C list. I would say that for our purposes, it's helpful to think of The Butler as part of a long overdue surfeit of major African-American themed films of the mid-2010s, whose best loved films were, I would still maintain, Django Unchained, Fruitvale Station, 12 Years a Slave, and Selma. One reason Lee Daniels walked away from the Selma project was that in 2009, after the election of Barack Obama, a guy named Steven Spielberg and Warner Brothers made a deal with Dr. King's estate for the filmic rights to all of Dr. King's speeches. For years then, Pitt and Gardner found it difficult to interest any filmmaker. They spoke to Spike Lee, they spoke to John Singleton, they spoke to Forrest Whitaker, among others, in making a film about King that would likely be unfavorably compared to the Spielberg version with the verifiable verbosity. However, that changed with the rise of one Ava DuVernay. Ava DuVernay was born in 1972 in Long Beach, California, raised in Linwood, and spent some of her childhood summers in her father's childhood home near Selma, Alabama. DuVernay graduated with a double BA from UCLA, began working in journalism, became disillusioned with journalism after the O.J. Simpson trial, found work as a junior publicist, founded her own public relations firm in 1999 for movies and TV shows, and launched various web platforms for millennial women of color. In 2005 and 2007, DuVernay used her own time and meager resources to make short documentaries that found their way to Showtime's Black Filmmaker Showcase. Her first feature, a hip-hop documentary called This Is the Life, won several awards, which she leveraged into getting a few name actors to work for almost nothing for 14 days to make her $50,000 dramatic debut, I Will Follow, an official selection of many 2010 and 2011 festivals. Around this time, DuVernay began aggressively shopping her 2003 written script, Middle of Nowhere, to various investors, one of whom happened to see British actor David Oyelowo, which I probably said wrong, on an airplane, and with DuVernay's texted approval, handed him the script. DuVernay had admired Oyelowo's work on many British projects of the 2000s, and Oyelowo liked that his role in Middle of Nowhere let him transcend stereotypes of the incarcerated Black man. After Middle of Nowhere debuted at the 2012 Sundance Film Festival to rave reviews, Oyelowo asked Duvernay about the Selma project, to which he had committed back in 2009 before Lee Daniels walked away from it. Obviously, not every 30-something Black actor could plausibly resemble the civil rights leader. Despite her direct link to the Selma region, Duvernay dithered, not least because Spielberg had the rights to the speeches and an apparent inside track to the King estate. At some point in the middle of 2013, after Pitt and Gardner had finished their post-production on 12 Years a Slave, Duvernay agreed to direct Selma for them as long as she could rewrite Paul Webb's script and receive co-author credit. Duvernay recounted hours hiking LA's canyons, listening to King's speeches, and she estimated that she rewrote 90% of Webb's script, but his contract guaranteed him sole writing credit, and Duvernay never talked him out of it. In early 2014, fresh off her turn as the female lead of The Butler, Oprah Winfrey signed on for a small role and a larger producer credit on Selma. And with both Winfrey and Pitt on board, Paramount agreed to a $20 million budget, about the same as 12 Years a Slave, which was far less than Duvernay had hoped, but far more than any African-American female filmmaker had theretofore overseen. Paramount also insisted on a quick turnaround to get the film ready for both the Christmas 24 Oscar season as well as the 50th anniversary of the depicted events that winter. Beginning in May 2014, Duvernay filmed most of the interiors in and around Tyler Perry Studios in Atlanta, and much like Ryan Coogler, she filmed the Selma exteriors in the actual locations, notably the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Okay. Any thoughts about anything I just said before I jump into the plot summary, Nikole?
No, I knew some of it, but I didn't know the history about Spielberg having the rights to the speeches. Yeah, I knew that Ava DuVernay had rewritten a lot of it.
Well, actually, in many ways, rewatching it, that's almost the most impressive thing about the film, is like how these speeches sound like things King would have said. But aren't necessarily exactly what he said. That's really fascinating. She talked about how he tended to emphasize things 3 times. He had this practice of like making a given point in 3 different ways and then moving on. I'm honestly, that's one of the most impressive aspects of this film. Once you know that, it's like, wow, how did she get this so close, but not actually that part of it to me is like, whew, that's amazing. I mean, I don't know. I watch that and go, wow. Anything else before I jump into the plot?
Yeah, no.
All right, cool. Selma begins with Dr. Martin Luther King practicing his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech to his mirror and his wife, Coretta, who wryly refers to their hardships with money and the Black community. As King orates at the podium in Oslo, the film flashes back to small Black girls tracking down a staircase of the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church just before and during the Klan-caused bomb explosion that claims their lives. When African-American Annie Lee Cooper attempts to register to vote, the white registrar demands she cite the preamble, she does, demands she cite the number of Alabama county judges, she does, and demands she name all 67 of them, prompting a denied stamp. In the Oval Office, President Lyndon Johnson hails Dr. King's Nobel, calls the '64 Civil Rights Act his proudest achievement, repeatedly puts his hand on King's shoulder, asks for King's help with his war on poverty, and parries away King's insistence on federal legislation that would guarantee all African Americans the right to vote and make them eligible to serve on juries which are all white and all forgiving of people like the bombers of the Birmingham Baptist Church. When Dr. King arrives in Selma with activists Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, James Orange, and Diane Nash, they're met by a cheerful organizer, Reverend James Bevel, who escorts them into a hotel where a white man punches King and gets swiftly subdued. In the Oval again, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover names King a degenerate, hears the president demand that nonviolent King remain civil rights leader compared to, quote, these militants, unquote, and suggests weakening King by exacerbating the tensions between Martin and Coretta. At their Atlanta home at night, Coretta answers the phone, hears her children threatened, hangs up, hails Martin, hears he's leaving for Selma again, and hints he should be careful. Historical FBI memos of King's activities appear as title cards over scenes like that one and the next one, where Dr. King calls and awakens Mahalia Jackson to hear her sing to him, a song that carries into the next scene where Dr. King and fellow activists of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference arrive and eat at the welcoming house of Amelia Boynton Robinson. At the podium at Brown Chapel in Selma, King makes the case for a federally guaranteed right to vote, to tumultuous cheers, as well as a historical FBI memo made into a title card that reads, quote, King and SCLC incite local Negroes in Selma, approximately 700 present, 6:22 p.m., logged, unquote. In the church cafeteria, when two leaders of the student nonviolent coordinating committee, John Lewis and James Foreman, confront Dr. King's half measures, King defends his methods as maintaining headlines and asks them if the local sheriff, Jim Clark, is the provocable kind, like Bull Connor. In sumptuous, sung over, slow motion shots, SCLC leaders, Selma residents, and King march to the registration office and kneel in front of it, prompting Sheriff Clark to physically clear the sidewalk, prompting a man to confront Clark, prompting Annie Lee Cooper to swat Clark away from him, prompting white cops to converge on Cooper and bring this Oprah Winfrey played woman to the ground, much as Oprah was in The Color Purple almost 3 decades before. Days later, in front of the same courthouse and Confederate flags, Governor George Wallace defends segregation and attacks the movement as President Johnson watches on TV with disgust. In prison, King despairs of their road and tells Abernathy, quote, they're going to ruin me so they can ruin this movement, unquote. But Ralph replies with reassurance and relief. After a pep talk from Amelia Robinson in Brown Chapel, Coretta King meets Malcolm X, hoping to help drive people to King. But when Coretta tells this to her imprisoned husband, King quotes X's worst criticisms of him and levels a few of his own. When George Wallace learns of King and X's alliance, he sends state troopers into a march in Marion, Alabama, and one of them kills young activist Jimmy Lee Jackson, prompting King's hyperbole at Brown Chapel that bemoans the slaying of Jackson and Malcolm X and cues the SCLC backstage to talk tactics and goals. Back at the White House, King tells LBJ that he's planning a 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery as a protest for voting rights, which infuriates LBJ and causes him to call in Hoover again. Back in the Atlanta house, after phone calls exposing King's infidelity, Coretta questions Martin on who he loves, complains of the constant closeness of death, and cues King to later call Abernathy to postpone the march for a day to let King care for his family. But Abernathy insists on keeping the schedule. In a pre-march montage, we see Wallace speechifying about free roads, cops preparing to bust heads, activists preparing to have their heads busted, King eating with his family, and the two SNCC leaders, James Foreman and John Lewis, bitterly breaking apart over the new blueprint. A white reporter voiceovers what we see, namely 525 African Americans calmly, firmly walking in formation from Brown Chapel to and over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they meet 300 armed troopers who call them an unlawful assembly, order them to disperse, don gas masks, hit the protesters with gas, whips, horses, bats, batons, and more. As the movement scatters back across the bridge, and the reporter, we now see him in a phone booth, says an injured John Lewis asked why Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but not Alabama, to cheers. One injured man prepares to get a gun, but Andrew Young convinces him that an armed response, however righteous, wouldn't get the right results. King watches the botched march on TV, speeds to Selma, tells reporters he wants more good clergy and persons to join the next march, and prompts an angry conversation between LBJ and his trusted white advisor, Lee White, that results in their white lieutenant, John Doerr, begging King to postpone the march to no avail. An FBI title card claims 1/3 of marchers are Caucasians, as King leads thousands over the Edmund Pettus Bridge to see troopers stand and suddenly stand aside, causing King to kneel in prayer, cue the marchers to kneel, and for King to turn around. The consequent combative conference at Brown Chapel blames King, but on the night streets of Selma, A white preacher slash protester named James Reeb confides in a colleague that he understands King's decision was probably guided by God until white thugs descend and kill Reeb. After King shares another contentious phone call with Johnson, he shares a more conciliatory car ride with John Lewis, who speaks of ongoing beatings and beliefs. In an Alabama courtroom, lawyers accuse King of breaking the law, but Black attorney Fred Gray successfully convinces Judge Frank Johnson to legally sanction the march, which the activists begin planning in earnest. In the Oval Office, Governor Wallace says blacks are never satisfied and he has no power over county registrars anyway. But the president replies to Wallace by using King's language on Wallace and deciding he won't be grouped in history with weasels like Wallace. We cut to many of the established activists' reactions as they see on TV Johnson announcing the Voting Rights Act. King confides in his white security detail that even though he may not see all his people's sunny days, he can keep going knowing that they will have more sunny days ahead. The film cuts to real archival footage of the actual Selma to Montgomery March of 1965, attended by everyone from Harry Belafonte to Dixie-bearing thugs, culminating in the film's characters arriving at the Capitol and King giving an uplifting, principled speech while titles inform us of the fates of the foregrounded. So I have now white-splained and mansplained this movie long enough. Nikole, let's go to you. What do you find most impressive about this film, or what do you think of it? What stands out about it for you, Selma?
I liked it, but again, this is a film that I come to with a lot of personal baggage behind how I view it.
Okay.
For one, my family hails from Alabama,
Okay.
and on my maternal side, my grandmother was from Tuscaloosa, which is about an hour and a half now, about an hour and a half outside of Selma. When I was little, it was about an hour because there wasn't so much traffic. And my mom spent some of her formative years in Marion, which is the next largest city outside of Selma.
Yeah, right.
Selma. So
Yeah.
when I would go down south in the summer, I'd spend half the summer in the Tuscaloosa, Selma area, and then half in the Gulf Coast, where my father's family
wow.
was from.
You know, your summers sound a little bit like Ava DuVernay's, because I think maybe her father was actually from Marion, or I can't remember now. But yeah, okay, so go ahead, yeah.
Actually, yeah, it's funny because and Ava's a year younger than me, and we have some other similarities. But so I have the sort of personal perspective of remembering Selma in the 70s,
right?
Having crossed the Pettus Bridge any number of times as a child, and then there's also again having studied that era and having studied, funny enough, part of how my career today is in large part due to a college course I took at Cal that was specifically on studying King and Malcolm X, and so I spent a year studying them.
Yeah. So you're kind of an inside. You're on the inside track on this one, yeah. So keep going.
So when I saw Selma, there were already certain things that I was looking for.
Right.
And so of some of the things that stood out to me included, for one, while Daniel's a great actor and he does have some physical resemblance to King, he did not ring true to me as King. It just didn't quite work for me.
There are some roles that I feel like are almost impossible for any actor to play. I kind of think King is one of them. I hate to say it because we know them so well that it's really hard. I don't know, at least that's my perspective. Is like, why even bother trying to cast an actor? Although I think he does fine, but it's a very hard role to play,
Exactly. And so they're and sometimes I remind myself that yes, that's a really hard role to play. And as I said, he's good. It's just, and for me, a lot of it is his voice and his cadence. It just wasn't quite there for me.
No, it wasn't.
There,
Yeah.
there's a
And
quality, there's a sort of a resonance to King's
right.
voice that he does not have. And there was also so almost a self-assuredness from King that you see in other religious leaders when they speak, and they
Yeah.
internally they know that they are speaking with the moral authority of God behind
Yep.
them. It
Absolutely.
colors how they come across, and
Yes.
he did not have that. And so that for me was I was like, okay, yeah, he's not bad, but there's just something not quite.
I personally
So
wonder
there
if
was that.
the British thing had something to do with it. I mean, maybe not. And I don't want to be somebody who says that, like, Chiwetel Ejiofor and David Oyelowo and the guy from Get Out. Why am I not remembering his name right now? Who won an Oscar for the
Yeah,
more recent
I know who you're talking about, and I can't
I
think of
mean,
his.
I don't want to say that they can't play American Black people, but in the case of King, I almost wonder if you needed an American to kind of dig out that big voice or something. I don't know, but because he certainly nailed. It's an American accent. I mean,
Yes,
he's American. He sounds American.
yes.
But I sometimes wonder if maybe an actual American actor could have maybe dug out that resonance that I just heard you mention. Maybe not. I don't know.
Well, the other thing that yeah, and so there was that, and then also there is the yet again based on historical events, not necessarily 100%. Um,
Right.
so um, when I come at it, things that I was like I in my head, in the way that I learned about Selma, I was expecting a more for there to be made more explicitly clear the tie between the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson
Right.
and the subsequent events. And
Sure.
so while the movie does deal with Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder, it doesn't deal with it as much as I would have liked.
I get
Uh,
that. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think it does. It's there, and you
yeah,
do have him. You do have the scene where King is criticizing Lyndon Johnson on the phone for saying, I appreciate you reaching out to Webb, the white preacher's family. I wish you'd given Jimmy Lee Jackson's family the same courtesy. I mean, I think that
yeah.
that plays, but you're right in which, like, it's not quite blink and you'll miss it, but it could have. It really is a choice of emphasis. By the way, Daniel Kaluuya is the name of the actor that I just didn't think of. But anyway, yeah. So okay, so emphasis. You felt like emphasis could have been a little different. Is what I'm.
Yeah, that well, certainly from the perspective of, again, of how I was taught about how these events built upon one another.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing, just as with 12 Years a Slave, where I was like, that it seemed like slavery porn, I was almost the opposite for me here, where one of the things that really struck me is I was like, I felt like they did not, they, while they conveyed the senselessness and the inhumanity of the attack on the bridge, I felt like it didn't really convey the true brutality of what went down on that bridge.
Right.
I'm like, we all know, as a matter of historical record, that they almost killed John Lewis,
Right. Yep.
um, and that that Miss Boynton was left there unconscious.
Yep.
So there were these little elements that I so in that regard, I wanted there to be almost a more realistic portrayal.
Right.
Uh,
I mean, going into that and knowing what I did know about the events, and I'm not saying I know as much as you do, but I knew that it would probably be one of these, like, how can I put it? Like a sound, there'd be a lot of, like, there'd be some kind of music, there'd be slow-mo, there'd be, smoke, the tear gas. I mean, I could kind of
yeah,
picture the way it was gonna go. And to be honest, it kind of met the way I figured. I mean, and I don't say that was wrong. I was trying to picture how events like this would be put in a film, and I kind of thought, okay, it's gonna look like that. But I agree with you. It could have been bloodier. It could, I mean, I sometimes wonder if they were trying to keep it to a certain degree of not bloodiness for the sake of future, teachers later using this in
Yeah.
schools, maybe, I mean, I can't help but think that it's possible DuVernay was thinking, okay, well, if people are going to use this as a teaching tool later, maybe I shouldn't actually split open John Lewis's head on screen or whatever. I mean, I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know, but I thought about that,
So
Um,
that was one of the things that I when I looked at the movie, I was just like, it needed a little more gritty realism for me.
right, right, right. Okay. Yeah, that's reasonable. Um, well, in that case, I feel like that actually segues into what was the big controversy about the unrealisticness of the film, or the people taking issue with Duvernay's creative license, or some people. So let me just go to that, and I want to hear your opinion on this, what I'm calling a controversy. So first, Selma opened to strong reviews and good box office for a $20 million film. However, only days after its December 2014 release, former Johnson administration aide Joseph Califano wrote a scathing editorial in the Washington Post that accused the film of making Lyndon Johnson, his former boss, look more interested in using the FBI against King than he was in passing the Voting Rights Act. An editorial where Califano included the words, quote, Selma was LBJ's idea, unquote. Well, Nikole, Califano's piece sparked a conflagration of heated debate amongst historians and film critics, and even like Instagram influencers, many of whom objected to one white man defending another white man's virtues while discussing a film by and about Black heroes who triumphed over white intransigence. To me, a great response quote to all that was from past and future Pulitzer winner Wesley Morris, African American, who concluded that, quote, a cultural rebalancing has upset people, unquote, because, quote, Johnson's not only the president of the United States here, he's also the help, unquote. I don't even know if Morris was trying to refer to The Help, the 2011 film, which, in retrospect could have been a little better. But anyway, so I also want to mention actually that remember I told you about that blog Information is Beautiful, which tries to go
Yeah.
scene by scene and give so they had given 12 Years a Slave that 88% rating. They rated Selma an accuracy of 100%. Now, I don't know. Maybe they're just saying that for the films it chose, for the scenes it chose to portray, it got them right. But anyway, so what do you think of that? What do you think of that? I mean, I don't know if you remember, because I really do. I remember living through that controversy and like so many angry kind of posts like, how dare you bring this up? What you're giving a white person credit for, haven't we had enough people crediting Johnson for being a hero in 64 and 65? I don't know. Any thoughts about any of that, Nikole?
I vaguely remember it
Mm-hmm.
being controversial. I think that I probably immediately wrote it off because in my head I'm like, well, that's just nonsense.
Right.
That's like the type of thing somebody comes along and says, oh, the sky is orange, on a beautiful blue day, and you're like, well, that's nonsense. So I'm not even going to bother to pay attention.
Right. It really defined a lot of posts about the film. I mean, there's like op-eds against op-eds. I mean, there was a lot. At least it seemed like everybody was weighing in on it all of a sudden, or how. And the thing is that I don't know that Ava DuVernay actually got any of this wrong. It was just a matter of emphasis,
Yeah.
And I think I do think that, at least in my opinion, I mean, we've heard these events from the white side. Let's hear them from a different side. And I personally enjoy, you tell me, because you know more about these events. I like that you have so many activists arguing, I mean, those scenes are gold to me, because I like that it feels like by the end of it, it's not just King's triumph, but like the triumph of the whole movement. I mean, that's
absolutely, again, from where I stood, and like the course that I took at Cal, we actually had members of SNCC who came in and talked to us.
Okay. Yeah.
As well as, over the course of the year, we had Panthers come and various others. But,
Sure.
They talked about the fact that, yeah, there was a lot of discord
Yep.
um, taking place because they did have different approaches.
Yep.
Um, and so I actually appreciated, yeah, I did appreciate that that got shown. Like so many of the movies of that, and books and such of that time. One of the other things that I do feel is lacking in Selma is there is the lack of emphasis on the importance of the women of the movement.
Yes, absolutely.
You know that coming away from it, I felt in many ways I felt like the most important woman in that movie is Miss Jackson. It has to do with how good she can cook. You know,
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good point because you only see her when she's like greeting the men coming to the house. Or that's not quite true, but I know what you're getting at. That
I
like,
mean, and
yeah,
they do give Coretta, her
some
moments there.
scenes.
But yeah, I'm like there were many other women who and for that matter, as history bared out, the importance of Miss Boynton,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
she's the one that
Yeah.
crosses the bridge with Obama
Yeah.
during his presidency.
Right.
Um,
I know what you mean.
so
I mean, they gave her that pep talk to Coretta Scott King about what
yeah,
Black people have endured for centuries. I mean, yeah, but I know what you mean. And well, the other thing that to me was interesting is that yes, Black women helped the movement. It's also true that, like in retrospect, a lot of the Black men organizers have been criticized for doing too much to sideline the women and making them like stay home and cook while they. I mean, and that doesn't really come forward in the film either. But again, I think
yeah.
it's a matter of emphasis. I'm not. I don't know that the film lied. It's more just that it chose to
What gets it?
emphasize
Yeah.
right. I do think. I mean, yeah, it's interesting because certainly we would guess that Ava DuVernay would know some of what you're talking about, and but I guess she had a 2-hour film, and there's only so much you can tell. I don't know. I mean, for me, I still think it comes off really well, or at least I think. I mean, I'm impressed with this film when I watch it. Um, I was
And this was a movie also where I really liked certain elements. uh I really liked and at other points really disliked the music choices.
okay. Yeah.
um so there's the scene where he calls Mahalia and she sings to him, and of course that's not Mahalia Jackson, and that just bugs me.
Well, it's an actress playing her. Oh, but you're saying that the singer of what's on this, the voice we hear on the soundtrack singing
Yes,
is actually is somebody pretending to be
to be,
Jackson?
yes, that's
Oh,
Laviki
that I
singing.
didn't
It's
even
not
realize that.
Mahalia
That's
Jackson,
terrible. Oh, wow.
and
Yeah,
it
why would
bugs
they do that?
me. My grandmother was a huge Mahalia Jackson fan. I grew up listening to Mahalia.
Right, right, right,
So the
right.
fact that it's not her just bugs me.
Yeah, I can see that. That is, even Jennifer Lopez lip synced all of the Selena songs in that. I'm saying, and she's a singer, but they still had her lip syncing, Selena's song. So I'm just pointing out that you're right.
But conversely, when they're crossing the bridge, and I think it's Jesus Take My Hand, I think is what's playing.
Yeah.
And that one is it's a classic. It's an old gospel singer. Her name
Right.
escapes me right now,
Okay.
but it's you can tell that it's music from the time period. At least I can tell because there's a quality to her voice that is indicative of that time period. Gospel singers don't sound like that now, and
Yes.
they didn't sound like that in the early 2000s. So I was like, yay, they went with music of the time.
Right.
And so that for me, that when they're when they're crossing the bridge, and I'm pretty sure it's Jesus Take My Hand that's playing, and I was just like, oh, that was just a wonderful. I think it's the second time that they're crossing the bridge when they've got their arms linked, and I was just like, oh, what a great choice to just really bring that scene home for me.
Yep.
And the movie also had for me one of the most enduring visual of the entire movie to me is
Hmm.
actually when they do the framing of the words Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Yeah.
because when they're doing it, before it pulls out enough for you to see that it's the rust that happens, it looks like it looks like that name is bleeding.
Yes, I noticed that too. Yeah.
And that's the image that stuck with me. I was like, wow, that was just an amazing bit of film work right there.
Well, at first I wondered if it, because the bridge was relatively new, I think, in the 60s. I mean, at least no more than 30 years old. And I wondered if it would have looked so rusted at the time, as opposed to how it looks now. But I also kind of thought, but you know what? Like you just said, it kind of works, you know?
And
um,
I think actually it would have, because you figure they didn't have the same types of sealants and stuff back
yeah,
then.
maybe you're right. You know, I'll defer to a real estate expert on this one. um, I was just gonna say, well, some felt that that whole Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King controversy amounted to a smear campaign against Selma in the height of awards voting season, because when Academy Award nominations were announced in the middle of January, Selma wound up scoring only 2 for Best Picture and for Best Song. The exclusion of director Ava DuVernay and lead actor David Oyelowo were 2 of the main reasons that activist April Rain coined that year the hashtag Oscars
Oscars
So White,
too. Oh yeah,
right?
Oscars so white. I thought it was
Which
too white.
wound up moving the Academy toward more diversity in years to come. Didn't happen right away, but it became a bigger thing as the years went on. I mean, I guess I don't know. Just to continue this talk about history, so this particular podcast episode, Nikole, has obviously begun with these 3 ostensibly true stories about African Americans from first the 21st, then the 19th, and now the 20th century. I guess I don't know what filmmakers owe the past. I mean, I don't know how accurate they need to be. I don't know what kind of creative license is reasonable. Do you think, I mean, you mentioned Ryan Coogler, where we kind of know he's going to take some creative license. We don't expect that the zip bag is necessarily going to be an accurate thing. I mean, how much did Ava DuVernay, did she owe us something that she didn't give us? I expect creative license. I expect characters to be like compressed, like 2 minor characters to be compressed into one. I expect things like that.
Yeah.
What do you think? What did Ava owe us? Did she owe us something that she didn't give us?
I don't think so, because
Okay,
again, this movie was not being presented as a documentary.
right. And she's
And
made documentaries. So go ahead.
yes,
Yeah, so go ahead.
but
Right.
that's not what this movie was.
Right.
And so and again, I feel like as long as the filmmaker is clear that this is not a documentary, I'm not doing a piece of nonfiction.
Right.
I'm doing a fictionalized version of history. Then yeah, there's going to be some creative license, and I'm fine with that, as long as the creative license, and then I think you said this earlier, is doesn't veer way off where into something where you're like, okay, that's actually exactly the opposite of what happened.
Sure. Yeah,
So
yeah.
when you get into that Lyndon Johnson King thing, I think that she didn't present it as Selma is Johnson's idea.
Right.
This was what Johnson's former dude came out and said.
Yes. Right.
So I don't think that we can ascribe that to Ava. That's not her problem. What he said is not her problem.
Yeah. Good point.
So I I think that using the historical records that she had on hand, I don't think that she veered way off track in terms of how much Johnson, and again, and it's known that Johnson did want to use the FBI against King. This is not a secret. So
right.
so yeah, I think that I don't think that she failed us in any way in terms of making things up or not delivering enough historical accuracy.
Right. Yep. Okay, great. Any other thoughts about Selma? I'm totally deferring to you on this one. I don't pretend to know.
Nope.
I would only one other thing I want to say about it is that, like, and this isn't even really about the film, but in large part because of Selma and its Best Picture nomination and everything, which was the first for an African American woman. I feel like Ava DuVernay has become so much more than just a director of films. You know, she's an action figure. She's the director of Netflix revisionist histories and African American museum projects. And she's the referent of the DuVernay test, which is like the Bechdel test, but for Black characters. When I think of what she's kind of become, I feel that we don't even realize how much we needed Ava DuVernay until we had her. You know, that's just a thought I have. You know, and honestly, she's carrying all of that pretty well. You know, she seems. I don't know if I would be as cheerful as her if I were her in interviews generally. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to explain it, but you know, when she's talking about brown sugar or whatever, or sorry, queen sugar.
Queen sugar, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she's, you know, she's cool. I mean, I don't know. So I give her a lot of credit for being nicer about all this stuff than she has to be.
Yeah.
One conversation that's prompted by films like Fruitvale Station, 12 Years a Slave, and Selma is if Black directors should be the only ones to direct Black stories. I don't know how you feel about that. I mean, if we decide that that's true, this principle would, in theory, extend to persons of color directing all stories about persons of color, and inevitably extend to white straight directors remaining in their lane by limiting their directing to that of white straight stories. Any feelings about that, Nikole? It's come up on this podcast before. I mean,
I do and don't agree.
Go ahead.
So I feel like the creativity pool is big enough for way more people than we currently have in it, and for way more perspectives than we currently have. So I think that we keep looking at it as a binary, and I don't think it should be a binary. That's where my problem lies with that argument. I think that we need way more Black directors and filmmakers telling Black stories. I also think we need Asian directors and filmmakers telling Asian stories and telling Black stories and telling white stories. We need the different gazes and the different perspectives. We need to see them all and see how they reflect back to us.
Perfect.
And I think that art is the medium that allows us to do that in a way that is sometimes, not always, but sometimes less painful than reality.
Yeah. You know, one move I thought was cool was when Lin-Manuel Miranda hired John M. Chu, the director of Crazy Rich Asians, to direct In the Heights. Because that was like a counterintuitive move. I don't think everybody was expecting that. I think people thought, well, maybe Lin will direct it himself. I mean, it's his play from 10 years ago, or he'll find a Latino. But he found an Asian, and I thought that was, I think that kind of thing going forward, we need more of those are cool, you know? Not because, you know, but also because John M. Chu, just based on Crazy Rich Asians, clearly could bring a lot to the story of In the Heights, you know, so that was also part of it, you know, so yeah, I like that.
But as I said, I do also at the same time think that we definitely need all these people telling their own community stories as well.
Yes, absolutely true. And I think going forward, I mean, the next time a white guy wants to tell a story like Selma, at least have, you know, Black writers involved in the room. I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
You know, no film is made with just the director. I mean, we like to give, in podcasts like these and in other places, we like to talk about the director as though they're the only author. Well, they're kind of not, you know. In fact, supposedly, for example, Steve McQueen and John Ridley fought over screenplay credit about 12 Years a Slave, just like Paul Webb and Ava DuVernay fought over screenplay credit. So these, you know, but any film is a collaboration between a whole lot of people. So I love the idea of getting more diverse talent behind the camera. That is awesome. But let's also remember that no film is made by itself. It's different. If we were talking about novels, that would be one thing, you know, okay, that's pretty much just the writer, you know. But yeah, so there's room, in other words, for more creatives on board, I think, too. Okay, well, cool. Then we can love to agree on this one. You said that better than I was going to say it, so thank you for that. the idea of like, can a white straight guy be an ally? I think one interesting wrinkle to that conversation is the career of Sean Baker, who was born in Summit, New Jersey in 1971, attended New York University, and credits as influences directors like Ken Loach, Mike Lee, Spike Lee, Jim Jarmusch, John Cassavetes, and Hal Ashby. Sean Baker spent most of his early career at the fringe of both the industry and American society. His 2004 film Takeout, about a Chinese immigrant in trouble in New York, was co-directed and co-produced by Shi Ching Tsao, a woman who has gone on to produce many of Baker's other films. His 2008 film Prince of Broadway was about a Ghanaian, that's from the country of Ghana, immigrant in trouble in New York. In 2012, at a film festival that included foreign films about trans sex workers, well-established actor-producer Mark Duplass approached Baker asking if the two of them might collaborate on something about their society's most marginalized instead of some foreign society. Mark Duplass and his brother Jay were then in the process of ramping up Duplass Brothers Productions, which was then collaborating with different studios to produce the 2012 films Safety Not Guaranteed and the Dodeca Pentathlon, as well as the 2013 film Bad Milo. However, major studios, Nikole, weren't exactly champing at the bit to become the first to make a film starring actual trans women as trans women, particularly as prostitutes. The Duplass brothers felt, I wonder why, right? It didn't exactly scream major studio hit, did it? The Duplass brothers felt they could personally devote $100,000 to the project, and Baker proceeded as though that would be the final budget, which is what happened. In early 2013, Baker went to the Los Angeles LGBT Center to find naturally dynamic trans personalities who would be willing to work for almost nothing. And he was lucky to find Kitana Kiki Rodriguez and Maya Taylor. The budget required making a virtue of necessity beyond anyone else's pre-existing virtues. After watching a few short iPhone films from festivals, Baker and his co-cinematographer Radium Chung made the rather radical decision to film a feature on 3 iPhone 5Ss. Using Duplass's name, they got discounts on the Filmic Pro app, which is a video app that controls focus, aperture, and color temperature, and it also captures video clips at higher bit rates. And they also got 3 anamorphic adapters from Moondog Labs. They also got a third clever little device. These were all for relatively cheap because of the Duplass brothers and their previous successes. They got Tiffin's Steadicam Smoothie to capture smooth moving shots. That's actually really crucial that if you're watching the film, they go around LA a lot. And if these shots were as shaky as my iPhone shots usually are, we would have all given up on this film a long time ago. But I would argue, the result was Tangerine. It was not quite the first film made on iPhones, but maybe first one made on iPhones with these kind of technological wizardry that they could afford because of these studios, these production houses willing to loan this equipment for so cheap, because they were hoping they could sort of leverage that into better, loaning it later to other people for more money. So this result was Tangerine, which is a film whose organic, vital, nitty-gritty, almost unprecedented street level style absolutely underlines its themes and messages, I would argue. Baker took a page from Joel Silver producing Die Hard by setting the story on Christmas Eve in Los Angeles, hoping for future December rentals. Joel Silver has already discussed how he did that. Okay, so any thoughts about anything I just said before I jump into the Tangerine plot summary? Go ahead.
It's super funny because I did not know any of that.
Yeah.
And when I got done watching Tangerine, my first thought was, what the hell did I just watch?
Yeah, sure.
I swear I just spent 2 hours watching somebody's iPhone video.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it feels, doesn't it?
And it feels exactly like that.
Right. And you're like, why would Daniel make me watch this thing?
This was just weird. And the other thing, though, that and as you were talking about, that came through, because when I was watching it, I was also like, these really seem like real people who just happen to be being filmed. They do not seem like actors.
It feels like that, doesn't it? Yes. There's like an almost un there's an authenticity there that feels like there you couldn't create it any other way, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, all right, let's review. Tangerine begins at a donut time at the corner of Santa Monica and Highland, where sex worker Alexandra offers Cinderella a Christmas Eve day donut, accidentally tells her Chester cheated on her with a, quote, white fish, unquote, whose name begins with D, chases Cinderella as she storms out of the donut shop, passes out flyers to her show, and calms Cinderella by accidentally redirecting her fury against Chester to the white fish. An Armenian taxi driver, Razmik, drives around several fairs, including a Cherokee Indian who explains why his name, Mia, isn't feminine. Cinderella, fresh out of 28 days in jail and able to enjoy her renewed estrogen, enters a bakery to accost a contact for the whereabouts of Chester or his lover, a drama that causes Alexandra to decamp. Somewhere in LA, two men vomit in Razmik's cab, so he stops, drags them out, lies them on the sidewalk, and says, "Who's going to clean this?" Alexandra gets into the Passat of a John who wants head but settles for a ball cupping for $40, but when he fails to get hard or come, he also fails to pay, leading to a fight in the street that only gets settled by a female cop who orders the parties to go their separate ways. Razmik picks up an African-American prostitute whom he attempts to go down on, but kicks her out of the car when he realizes she's not trans, has no penis, and was on a misleading corner. Cindy smashes her way into a seedy motel brothel, finds Caucasian dyed blonde Dinah, pulls her off of an old man in a shower, and drags Dinah out while freaking the brothel out. Razmik gives Alexandra head in his cab in a car wash, drops her off, and hops home to a wholesome Armenian family Christmas. While Alexandra waits at an empty club, Cindy learns the location of Chester, drags Dinah into a bus, realizes the time, oh my God, 7:08, reroutes to the club, and arrives just in time for the club owner to permit Alexandra to perform for her friends. In the bathroom, Alexandra rips Cindy for how she's treating Dinah, while Cindy preps Alexandra for her performance, which we soon see in a silky red dress singing Toyland to the enthusiasm of about 4 or 5 people. To the considerable consternation of his mother-in-law, Ashkin, Razmik leaves the Christmas table, ostensibly to work, although we see him arriving at the club learning that Alexandra and Cindy have bounced. On the bus, Dinah tells Alexandra that her singing sounded old. Finally, Cindy reunites with Chester, asks about a Christmas present, gets an excuse, but presents him one, namely Dinah, leading to a lot of shouted counter-accusations hushed by Mama-san, the Asian store manager, although Chester acts much more devoted to Cindy than to Dinah. Ashkin finds an Armenian cab driver who is part of Razmik's network and can take her to Razmik, who shows up at donut time to proposition Alexandra and Cindy. When Ashkin arrives, however, voices elevate over what Ashkin calls gay prostitutes and what Cindy considers cheating. Ashkin calls her daughter, who arrives with her and Razmik's baby girl, and even more drama and cross accusations that Alexandra views bemusedly, but Mama-san views as reason to call the police and kick everyone out. Although Razmik's wife rebukes her own mother as needing to mind her own business, Razmik returns to a lonely, empty, Christmas-decorated living room. Outside donut time, when Chester learns Alexandra started all this, he tells Cindy he slept with Alexandra as well, resulting in a scattering that Dinah finds funny at first until she returns to the motel brothel and no work. Alexandra accosts Cindy to apologize as Cindy accepts her sorry, so she'll leave her alone. But Alexandra remains a block away, watching Cindy covering her corner until a car of possible tricks throw a 32-ounce cup of urine on her while also throwing transphobic slurs. Alexandra rushes over, drags Cindy into a laundromat, helps her undress, puts her clothes and wig in a dryer, sits with her there, and loans her wig. Nikole, what did you think of Tangerine? What stands out about it for you?
I found it really difficult to follow. And although conversely, this was one of those films where, as I was watching it, I'm thinking to myself, this can't have been scripted. This just, who would write this? This is the type of thing that just happens. And maybe because I know people who've had things like that happen, all that drama, all of that, I was like, yeah, no,
Right.
This is this
It plays like a Real
it truly
Housewives
comes
episode.
across as life is stranger than fiction.
Right.
Um, it was just like wow.
But then when you get to donut time in the last like 20 minutes, you realize it definitely was scripted because it, you know, it culminates in something.
Yeah,
You know, all the 8 characters that we've so far known, they all show up together. I mean, that part of it is kind of Shakespearean. You know, that Shakespeare
yeah.
Act 5 would always get all the characters together, you know, you know. But anyway, I'm not calling it a Shakespeare play because it's not. But you know, I'm just saying it's traditional dramatic structure, right? Um,
Um,
other
so
thoughts
yeah,
about it?
that was I was just like, oh Lord, what is happening?
Yeah.
Um, and then the the recurrence of as we're watching her walk, you
Yeah.
know, that just that over and over,
Right.
like up and down the street, and like after the 6th or 7th shot of that, I was like, really again?
Were we being asked to notice that that Cindy had kind of a small butt for a woman? Was that part of the point? I couldn't tell if that.
Neither could I. And I was wondering, are we supposed to be noticing her figure?
Right.
Why is this coming up again and again?
Yep.
Um,
Sure. Go
Funny
ahead.
enough, one of the things you mentioned in the summary, one of the scenes that absolutely just flummoxed me was the barfing in the cab.
Yes.
And I'm like, the hell is the point of this?
I guess just to show that that happens and that whatever, you know, that didn't stop Razmik from doing his usual job or whatever, you know.
So yeah,
Or
there was that. My favorite scene in the whole movie though was with the cop and the $40 blowjob,
yeah,
and
that was
then
funny.
the business transaction. That
Right.
to me was the best scene in the whole movie. I loved that.
Right. That was funny that Alexandra was very ready with that you know, quip.
Yeah, a business transaction, you know, and the cop. You know what? It's Christmas Eve. We all want to go home tonight.
Exactly, right. Although these people don't seem to have much of a home other than donut time, but yes, right. Um, other thoughts? I mean, the thing is, it's like, you know, it's funny for me. I lived in LA for years, you know, in my 20s and 30s. And one thing I love about this film is it really feels like it's happening in LA.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
I used to drive around Santa Monica and Highland. I feel like everybody does. I mean, like within that 10 block radius. And you can kind of tell they really filmed it there. I mean, I've
yeah.
seen so many films that are supposedly set in LA, including the film we're going to finish this podcast with. And it's often hard to tell that you're really there. It could be anywhere. Whereas, like, one thing I like about Tangerine is that it sort of repurposes these streets that any Los Angelino knows pretty darn well. And it repurposes, well, when I say repurpose, it sort of shows, by the way, there's prostitutes working these streets, you
Yes,
know, all the time, in case you weren't really noticing that, you know.
yeah,
And I kind of like that on some level because it sort of it refocuses you a little. If you're from LA or if you've spent any time there, you sort of go, oh yeah, that's true. They are there, you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
It almost,
I lived in LA in the late 80s, and I definitely, yeah, I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely
that
LA.
corner, yeah. I mean, it really looks like it, you know, like there's no faking it, you know. And then they're not trying to fake it. But I like that because sometimes it seems fake, like LA has been faked, you know.
One of the other things
Go
that
ahead.
struck me visually about it, I don't know if they were using a color filter, um, but just the coloration of, and it was also one of those cases where I was like, is this my screen? Is that why everything, or are
Yeah.
they underlying the tangerine thing with making everything look kind of peachy?
Yeah. Right. You know, I don't know. That's a good question. Well, should have done more research. I guess I'll have to go back to the lab. Yeah, I don't know. I do think, I mean, based on this and the Florida project, I definitely consider Sean Baker a talented director. I mean, you know, this is not just like, it might look like a home movie, but it's designed to look that way.
Yeah,
You know, I don't know. So there is something to this film. There's a germ of I don't know, artistry here, at least for me.
And
Um,
and as I said, the drama. The thing is, while it 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 is both over the top and yet to me incredibly realistic. It's actually funny enough one of the same things here, and maybe this is just a function of the people that I know, but it was much like when I watched The Hangover, the original, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I could absolutely see that happening." And other people were like, "What?" And I'm like, "Oh no, I the people that I know, oh yes, all of that would have happened. I have similar stories."
that is hilarious. That's hilarious.
And Tangerine struck me this. I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely know people where that level of drama is absolutely a thing. You know, the fighting in the bathroom, and actually I love that bit where we're watching the shower curtain get yanked down. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh yeah, I actually remember seeing somebody having a fight in the bathroom once where that happened. So there were definitely notes of realism that struck me, and but again, in terms of the filmmaking, little things like that, where, as I said, if I would assume that that was not the part of the scene that they wanted you to focus on, but that's what caught my eye
Yeah.
in that scene is watching the shower curtain get yanked at the
Yep.
scene.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I think, and this is a theme that I've talked about on this podcast before, is when you have an all black cast or an all Latino cast, and then in this case, I don't want to call this an all trans cast because it's not, but whatever, we're in the trans milieu. I think certain little details emerge that just wouldn't happen in a version of the movie where like big white actors were playing all these roles, if that makes any sense. Like
Yeah,
there's little details, little nuances, little things that pop up that feel much sort of more realistic. And I like when I was an example of this to me was watching A Raisin in the Sun, the 1961 film, because like you have an all black cast and there's a scene where somebody says Miss Thing. And I was thinking, Miss Thing, had American film audiences in 1961 heard anyone ever say Miss Thing? I don't think so, based on every film I've seen before that was released before 1961. Now, maybe, but it's a blink and you'll miss it. My point is that like there's just little things that pop up when you've got the right cast there.
yeah,
And I think that this movie for me, Tangerine, is one more example of that. The cast is right. It suits the material, and so
yeah.
little like what I'm hearing you talk about, sort of moments of grunge or just lower class kind of desperation just come up in a way that they might not if this movie had been made with a bunch of major actors or something. You know what I mean?
One of the other things, because I talk about the music in the different movies, and this one,
Yeah.
the music that caught me was the music in the opening credits, because
Yeah.
it's so out of place.
Yeah. That's funny.
Like what? For that matter, even this was one where that lovely script that is the credits,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
I was just like, wow, what a wonderful dichotomy there, because you got
Yes.
this great script, beautiful like classic handwriting, this lovely soft music, and then the movie happens. You're like, wait, what?
Right. Absolutely.
So and then that's a deliberate choice on the part of the filmmaker, and
Oh yeah.
I enjoyed that.
By the way,
Amazing.
Nikole, thank you so much throughout this podcast of drawing our attention to the music, because I do think it's important, and makes a big difference. Yeah, and with Tangerine, oh my God, all that music, that like when she's walking, that boom, 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 boom,
Yes.
like my God, I mean, we're really like as though we're in the club or something, and it's daylight and we're out in LA. I mean, it's like, wow, okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention that Tangerine is not, by no means, the first American fiction feature to centralize trans persons. The C-list had already featured Glenn or Glenda, arguably.
I remember that.
Yeah, and Boys Don't Cry. And also, I talked about Yentl, depending on how you read the ending of that film. The A-list arguably afforded more monstrous representation of trans persons with Psycho and The Silence of the Lambs, depending on how you read those films. But with Tangerine's 96% Rotten Tomatoes score, a good 20 points higher than that of 2005's Transamerica, it's fair to call Tangerine the best loved 21st century film centralizing the transgender. Also, all those other films star cis actors playing transgender persons. Tangerine is the best known, best loved film to feature trans actors playing trans persons. And I think that's crucial. I think that's an intervention we needed. I also want to say that in terms of the second Obama administration, well, personally, I guess I'm patting myself on the back here, Nikole, so sorry. I like the way this podcast episode starts with 3 African-American directed films of telling long neglected historical Black stories, and then ends with 2 fiction films set in the here and now that kind of centralize this racial melange where ethnicity is barely mentioned, even as we see events wouldn't be happening the same way if everyone in the film were part of the overculture. I also like that these final 2 films represent opposite extremes in terms of budget, class, and cultural capital. Because, Sean Baker's $100,000 film shot on iPhones, that's its own, pan-racial roundelay of Los Angeles's most marginalized, most discriminated against citizens, right? Whereas our 5th and final film is James Wan's $190 million blockbuster about a group of ragtag pan-racial Angelinos who have become the U.S. government's greatest secret assets. That's going to be my segue. Should I keep going with my segue? Are we good?
I think we're good.
All right, cool. Well, my C list, here we are at number 95, out of 100. It's not complete without a film from the Fast and the Furious franchise. At risk of quoting Wesley Morris again, I do think he explained it best when he reviewed Fast 5 back in 2011. He noted at the time the glaring whiteness of almost all big budget movies up to that point in 2011. But he pointed to what for him was the one exception, quote, "A collection of movies that in its utopian way puts Blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, and their various combinations on equal footing. It would be like a grown-up Sesame Street, except for the deadly road races and the fact that the puppets have tattoos, guns, muscles, bald heads, and a ton of moving violations." And then he said, and this is the final sentence, "Go on and laugh your Benetton, Kumbaya, Kashi, Quinoa laugh, but it's true. The most progressive force in Hollywood today is the Fast and Furious movies," unquote. Nikole, this C list was never going to include all 10 of these films for the same reason. It's the same reason it didn't include all 8 Mexican Spitfire movies. I couldn't fit in more than one. But having to narrow it down to one, I chose the best reviewed of the bunch, which is also the highest grossing majority minority cast film of all time, Furious 7. Furious 7 is also the only film in the worldwide top 10 to be majority minority, where a majority of the lead cast members are non-white. The term Fast and Furious, now we're really going, hey, Nikole, get ready to go back to the 20s. Are you ready for that? I mean, I'm not talking about these 20s. I mean the 20s that happened 100 years ago. The term Fast and Furious, like the term wild and woolly, seems to have come from nowhere around the time of America's first national radio broadcast in the 1920s. Fast and Furious may have been an advertising term or a parody of one, and was never exactly a national catchphrase. It wasn't huge, but it had just enough valence to serve as a title for 3 unrelated films in 1927, 1939, and 1954. And that's not counting, Nikole, the first Coyote Roadrunner cartoon, which was called Fast and Furry Us. The very first one, yes. There were no Fast Furious identified films in the 70s. Instead, there were car crash and car convoy films, from French Connection to Cannonball Run. This formula seemed to have run dry until the late 90s, when Uber producer Jerry Bruckheimer noticed that improving computer graphics technology gave him the power to film a car wrecking movie where he wouldn't necessarily need to wreck so many cars. That led to a remake of Gone in 60 Seconds, which helped move forward another project dreamed up in 1999 because of a New York street racing subculture. Knowing of Gone in 60 Seconds, director Rob Cohen and screenwriters Gary Scott Thompson and Eric Bergquist took what was good about it, namely Los Angeles, and they changed what they didn't like about it, making their story more ethnic than Bruckheimer's. They took the name from Roger Corman's 1954 film about racing cars. Corman, still alive then, still alive now. You let him have it. Cohen, Thompson, and Bergquist failed to interest any A-list actors, but they acted as though the cars would be the stars. Interesting. 2001's The Fast and the Furious starred Vin Diesel as Dom, Paul Walker as Brian, Jordana Brewster as Mia, and Michelle Rodriguez as Letty, and was a big enough hit to justify a sequel that Diesel refused to do, namely Too Fast, Too Furious, starring Walker and Tyrese Gibson as Roman. Both those films earned reasonable returns but reprehensible reviews, and Walker walked away from any third entry. As mentioned on this podcast before, Jeremy Lin of Better Luck Tomorrow was happy to take a job almost no one else wanted when he signed up to direct The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift, which retconned Better Luck Tomorrow's character and actor of Han into the Fast Furious franchise and also killed him in the same movie. The Chris Morgan scripted Tokyo Drift, starring Lucas Black as Sean and Bow Wow as Twinkie and featuring Vin Diesel in a last-minute cameo, was the franchise's least successful film. Was Universal just going to find a young white actor and young black actor every couple of years and get them to solve crimes around racing subcultures? Well, Universal cautiously prepared to do just that with Morgan's next script. But when Diesel and Walker watched the full range of Lin's talent directing Tokyo Drift, they signed up to work with him, reprise their roles, and obtain the other original cast members, as well as Sung Kang and Gal Gadot. Part of the attraction for these actors was that the Fast and Furious films were the only major budget, racially integrated films to get premium releases abroad. Weirdly, they were the only blockbusters of the late 2000s sending any kind of consistent message about scruffy American diversity and can-doism. Of all franchises, only the Fast cast could equally pass in both action scenes and at the MTV Music Awards. This helps explain why Chris Ludacris Bridges returned and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson signed up for the next film, Fast 5, in roles that both carried over into that film's sequel, Fast and Furious 6, which was a movie that demonstrated a certain confidence by having its villain's brother kill the Han character during its credits. This moment more or less promised a sequel starring none other than Jason Statham, as well as resolving the franchise's time loop. Han would now be dead and Letty recovering from amnesia. In 4 films then, the 3, 4, 5, and 6, Justin Lin and writer Chris Morgan had set the franchise on rather enviable territory that no other franchise could be on, especially in a Hollywood that by 2013 absolutely refused to spend more than $50 million on any film that was not pre-established intellectual property. So they got in under the wire, Nikole. If they hadn't, then they couldn't. Now, that said, after Fast and Furious 6, Jeremy Lin had grown a wee bit weary of wheels and was happy to hand off directorial duties to James Wan, therefore mostly known for horror. The cast of Furious 7 was rather remarkable. In addition to series now regulars Diesel, Walker, Rodriguez, Gibson, Brewster, Bridges, and Johnson, were they the 7 people in the title? The new film found room for Jason Statham, Kurt Russell, Jimon Hansu, Ali Fazal, Lucas Black, Iggy Azalea, T-Pain, Romeo Santos, UFC fighter Ronda Rousey, Thai martial artist Tony Jaa, Game of Thrones' Natalie Emmanuel, and archival footage of Sung Kang and Gal Gadot. Nothing against the remarkable cast of Selma and Ava DuVernay, but if DuVernay had insisted on any 4 of those actors I just mentioned, Paramount probably would have walked away from the film. They just would have said, no, it's too expensive. We can't do it. I mean, that gives you a sense of where this film was at this time. And by this time, principal photography for Furious 7 began in Atlanta in September 2013, many months before DuVernay arrived there for Selma, and continued for 10 weeks until November 30th, when lead actor Paul Walker unthinkably died in a single vehicle accident outside production. At first, the internet blamed life imitating art, and Universal indefinitely postponed the film. After a few weeks, cooler heads prevailed and decided to finish the film for Paul. Although actors had died and been replaced by computer graphics going back to Gladiator, the year 2000, Walker still had about 1/3 of his scenes left to film. Universal hired Weta, the Wizards of Middle Earth, who pulled extant footage of Walker from 5 films and superimposed it onto Walker's 2 brothers, Cody and Caleb, and another stand in. The easy thing would have been for longtime series writer Chris Morgan to kill Brian. The harder thing was for Morgan to keep Brian alive, but retire him from active work with the crew. The final 5 minutes of Furious 7 are an almost fourth wall breaking tribute to an actor and character without any kind of precedent in 9-figure filmmaking. Furious 7 begins in a London hospital room where Deckard Shaw promises his comatose brother that he will, as usual, clean up his mess, and the camera turns to see the mess Shaw apparently left on the way in, with dozens of shot up walls and bodies as Shaw elegantly exits a crumbling edifice. In the middle of Nevada, Dom brings Letty to Race Wars to remind her of her memories and skills, but after she wins a race, her flashbacks prompt her to punch a punk and storm off. In the suburbs, Brian has trouble finding minivan buttons as he drops off his young son Jack, whose errant throw of a toy causes Brian to say, "Cars don't fly." At a graveyard, Letty stops Dom from sledgehammering her grave and explains that she needs to find herself, even as they both mourn the loss of Han, as seen in the credits of Fast and Furious 6. In an LAPD office, when Officer Luke Hobbs hails Shaw hacking his computer, the following fistfight finishes with Shaw tossing an explosive puck, which blows Hobbs and his assistant Elena several stories onto a parked car. At Brian and Mia's house, while Brian plays with his son, she privately reveals her second pregnancy to her brother Dom, who gets a warning phone call from Tokyo that points him to the porch's package from Tokyo just before it explodes, destroying the house and nearly, but not, knocking off Dom, Brian, Mia, and Jack. In an LA hospital, Hobbs hands Dom extensive files on Shaw, gives him the formal command to stand down, and informally advises him not to miss. In the Dominican Republic, Mia settles into Mondo's safe mansion, tells Dom on the phone that they have to keep the pregnancy from Brian if he's to be of any use, and gets Brian to promise that this is truly his final job before retirement. Dom goes to Tokyo, meets Sean Boswell, brings a necklace cross along with Han's body to LA, attends the funeral, sees his crewmates Roman and Tej chit-chat with Brian, notices Shaw on the periphery, chases Shaw's sports car with his own muscle car through Los Angeles, and plays a game of chicken where they crash into each other. Shaw almost shoots Dom until the arrival of a group of special forces led by Mr. Nobody, who fire at Shaw, seem to let him escape, and bring Dom into an off-the-grid warehouse where Mr. Nobody reveals the God's Eye, world-ubiquitous surveillance system that Ramsey invented, but took with her when she was kidnapped by Shaw's terrorist friends led by Moss Jakande. Mr. Nobody explains why Dom needs his resources and why he needs an off-the-books guy like Dom and his crew, whom nobody gestures to, namely Brian, Roman, Tej, and, surprisingly, Letty, who also wants to avenge Han. When Roman makes a big stink out of never being able to lead, Nobody lays out the map, and Roman chooses Shaw's associates' most invulnerable spot because that's where they won't expect to be attacked. Roman is less enthused about the resulting plan, as most of the crew falls out of the airplane piloting muscle cars, so Roman tries to remain in the plane until Tej activates his chute, which yanks his car into the sky. After a long, dramatic fall, just before touching the ground in the Caucasus Mountains in Azerbaijan, each team member activates a secondary heavy-duty chute that stabilizes their cars enough for them to land just behind Jakande's convoy as Mr. Nobody coaches on comms from his warehouse. During a thrilling car chase, Brian fights Kiet and almost falls with a bus off a cliff, but escapes as Dom recovers Ramsey, fends off Shaw, faces off with Moss Jakande, and escapes by driving himself and Ramsey off a cliff. Later, apparently by an Azerbaijani lake, Ramsey shows she well understands the crew as she reveals that she left the crucial God's Eye chip inside a flash drive with a friend in Abu Dhabi. On the ride there, when Brian admits he missed the feeling of bullets, Dom tells him the manliest thing he ever did was make a family with Mia and not to lose that. On an Abu Dhabi beach, the crew meets Safar, who explains that the flash drive is being kept almost too safely in a supercar in a billionaire's 100-floor penthouse but he can get them into that guy's party tomorrow if they change their clothes. At the Sybaritic revels, after Tej's hacking and Letty's rounds with Ronda Rousey, who cares what her character's name is, Dom and Brian find the car with the flash drive, but when bad guys, including Shaw, come after them, Dom drives the supercar off the 100th floor as Brian in the passenger seat pleads, "Cars don't fly!" over to the next skyscraper, and then the one after that before they barely jump out with the chip to see the car fall 1,000 feet to the street below. After the crew return the chip to Mr. Nobody, he hands it right back to them for their search for Shaw. So Dom hands it to Ramsey, whose full-tech God's Eye mapping soon finds Shaw's hideout in a remote desert, but when the crew arrives there, they find themselves outmanned, outgunned, and out of there. Mr. Nobody warns Dom that Shaw and Chikandi know they need Ramsey for full God's Eye access and won't stop until they get her. Overlooking their city from Dodger Stadium, which is a callback to there's a lot of callbacks to the earlier films. The crew hatches a plan to play hot potato with Ramsey while counter-hacking the bad guy's hack, which will only work within a 2-mile radius. Dom puts Hans Cross on Letty, promises to come back for it and her, and privately tricks out his kit, muttering, "One last ride," while Brian calls Mia, learns their daughter on the way, and promises to be a full family man right after this. At night, in and around downtown LA, Jikande's Blue Thunder-ish helicopter and his aerial drone pursue the crew in a series of spectacular stunts as Ramsey's hacks and counter-hacks fail to foil each other's systems. Dom finds Shaw on a rooftop, plays chicken again, bounces his car on top of Shaw's, gets the upper hand and considers shooting Shaw, but chooses to street fight him in an epic one-on-one. Brian has his own extended one-on-one with Kiet that results in Kiet falling down an elevator shaft, too slow, as Brian renewing Ramsey's connection to God's Eye. Hobbs, in the hospital, watches the news, looks outside, rips off his cast, or really just flexes it off. It's quite the flex. Triple fist bumps his daughter, and just when an aerial drone following Letty, driving Ramsey through a tunnel, is about to land on them, Hobbs instead drives an ambulance off a land bridge and lands on the drone. Jikande's copter strafes Dom and Shaw's rooftop so completely that Dom can kick the right plate and watch Shaw fall with and through several stories. But Jikande is about to deal a death strike to Dom from the copter when Hobbs' howitzer fires on that copter. Dom scrambles for his ride, reuses the rubble as a ramp, projects his car towards Jikande's copter, but only scrapes it enough to hang a package on it before he and his car fall several stories, to the horror of the crew. Hobbs sees the package on the copter, fires at it, and watches as it explodes and falls to the street. As the panicky crew gathers around an unconscious Dom, Letty pushes away Brian's CPR to tell Dom how much she now remembers as flashbacks bring us memories, moments, and matrimony until Dom awakens by saying, "It's about time." Hobbs locks Shaw in a supermax as they exchange caustic comments. On a beach, the crew watches Brian play with his wife and kids and remark that Brian is where he belongs, although Dom says it's never goodbye, walks away, gets in his car, and drives, only to see Brian pull up asking if he thought he could leave without saying goodbye. The two of them drive side by side on a coastal highway as Dom flashes back to major moments of Brian throughout the previous franchise films. Dom voiceovers, "You'll always be my brother," and the road divides as the cars separate and the camera follows Brian's car into the sunset. Okay, we are finally done with all these film explanations. Nikole, your thoughts on this final film of today's podcast?
Furious 7 is batshit crazy.
No arguing.
The whole movie is batshit crazy.
Yes.
It's a soap opera melded with an action movie.
Yes. Yeah, it's an unending. Yeah, go ahead. You go.
When
ahead.
I watched it, and we have the God Eye, and I was like, oh my God, this is the class. I mean, in soap operas, my thing was always General Hospital. There was the Ice Princess. It's the device that controls the weather.
Yeah.
In Days of Our Lives, there was a device that controlled something or other. So there's always a device that you're after. And when you put it in the action movie context, now everybody, you've got action around getting the device.
Sure, of course.
At a much bigger scale than you can get in a soap opera.
Yes, you do.
And it's just from the very from the opening scenes, like with you got Jason Statham walking out of the hospital,
Right.
and I love the visual of how that beam crashes down just as he's
Right.
walking away, and it's such a classic action movie thing of the who normally you would think it's the hero walking away as everything blows up behind him, but in this case it's not, but it was just from that second on it was just like, wow, what's going to happen next.
I love the way that is done, where the movie is saying we don't even need to show you this crazy opening action scene. Like we're only like, to me, one thing that James Wan achieves by not even having that be some big action scene, or by just showing you the aftermath, is like, we're only going to show you the good stuff. We're not even, if we don't even want to, we may not even have an action scene if we don't feel like we know that. So that
Yeah.
already establishes, oh, okay, we're only seeing the good stuff, which I think is fun, right off the bat. Sorry.
And I mean, and ultimately, I think the thing that I love the best about this movie, and it ties into one of the things that you were saying at the beginning, where this is the one where I think they really achieve the goal. The cars are the characters in this movie.
They are.
The cars are way more interesting than the people.
That's so funny. Yeah.
And the cars do. So that the jumping, I'm like, because yeah, and in previous action movies, it's the guy swinging through the glass window from building to building. Not in this one, it's the car. The car jump from building to building. The cars parachute.
Yes, right.
Instead of people. I'm like, this is just great.
Yeah, go ahead.
The one thing that bugged me is the bus hanging over the edge.
Oh, yeah.
That scene really did irritate me, because I was like, this bus needed to have fallen off already. This is just this, and there's always, of course, a huge degree of suspension of belief that has to happen for an action
Speaking of
movie.
suspension, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
But this was just a bridge too far for me with him on that bus. Sure. I was just like, come on, no.
Yeah. It was gratuitous. I'm with you there. Yes, it wasn't the only gratuitous scene in the film, but I hear you loud and clear.
But that was the one that was, I was like, no.
Right. No, I know what you mean. And the thing that also didn't work for me was like when Dom and Ramsey face off against, Jimon Hansu and like the 10 cars they're all pointing in it. I thought, well, okay, wait, so they need some amazing way to get out of this. I thought maybe he was going to open like a third parachute or something, but the only way he got out of it was just by falling off the cliff. I'm like, but the way they could have done that already. I mean, that seemed a little strange to me, but that was their big reveal, because they'd set it up to be some amazing, trick he was going to pull. But anyway, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's always going to be little things like that. But I think, yeah, it's funny. This movie, that you described it so perfectly. It's a mix of soap opera and action film. It's a mix of like your friends are your family, and these blockbuster imperatives of like scenes topping scenes. But it's funny, from all that, I really think this car flying theme or motif is really strong in the film in a way that it actually hadn't necessarily been in the previous films. I mean, not to say that cars didn't fly in the previous films, because sometimes they did, but this is different. I mean, we're talking about the whole, first of all, it's foregrounded by the kid, by Brian telling his son, hey, cars don't fly. Yeah. They didn't do that in a previous film. But not only that, but like just the parachuting down, the secondary shoots, the 3 buildings in Abu Dhabi that the car goes through. I mean, it's almost like, oh, and you know what gets me about this? And I forgot to mention this, but I don't know. So Back to the Future, the first film, you know how it's set 30 years in the future? It's, you know how the final line of it is roads. Where we're going, we don't need roads. And they're going to 2015 in that, literally. And this movie came out in 2015. I almost wonder, and it's also a Universal film. Those are both. So I almost wonder, I smelled a tie-in there. I smelled a kind of, I mean, am I crazy? I smelled like, I thought Universal was going to have some way to say, well, you know what? We're finally in the future. There was all this like hullabaloo around arriving to the 2015 and like things that hadn't happened yet, and where are the flying cars? Well, here they are. Kind of. or as much as it could be, which I thought was kind of fun, you know, in its own way. So anyway, I just thought but I'm so glad you pointed out about the cars. It's sort of like there was this thing about how much can you defy gravity? You kind of can't. And in some ways, I think that actually works for the characters of Dom and Brian and Letty, that they're basically on some level coming back to gravity. Even the way Dom's his fight, you know, because he tried to get the helicopter, but it didn't quite work.
make it.
And he almost died, or we're meant to think he came very, you know, I don't know. The first time I saw this film, I was totally expecting Brian to die. I was expecting there to be a big scene where Brian either died or almost died.
Yeah.
You know, I kept getting ready for that. So it was actually a little shocking to me that it was Dom in that. I mean, the first time I saw it, I was actually, I remember being surprised. I'm like, wait, it's Dom who's going to almost die here, you know? But I think in a way it all ties together. I mean, I'm saying this is a better made film than some blockbusters, and I would include some Fast and Furious films. I do think there's a lot of tying together here that generally works. What about for you? What did you think it worked? Did you think the way they sent off Brian or Paul Walker was good or well done? What was your feeling about that?
I didn't think it was bad.
Yeah.
I honestly just didn't think that much about it.
Okay.
Even though I knew, I mean, I remember when he died, and it just, yeah, I was like, oh, that's kind of nice. But in many ways, it was after all of the adrenaline of the entire movie, that was not necessarily the come down that I was.
Yeah.
And I find that actually to be true and often with action movies. Once you hit that climax, depending on how strongly you've built up to it, that the aftermath, you're kind of like, really? That's how you're going to end it?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, because I was so invested in those cars flying and blowing up and fights and.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is normally not my kind of movie. It's just, I was just like, wow, this is intense. I like this. And also, I like some of the actors. One of the things that really amused me to no end was that when we see Hobbs, and it's funny because I saw them somewhat out of order, because the first movie in the Fast and Furious series that I saw was Hobbs and Shaw.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, you did see these a little out of order. Go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of went from there. But I love that, you know, there's Hobbs in the hospital and he's watching the Hulk, and he's watching the Hulk as he's changing into the Hulk and he's expanding and his clothes are popping off. So that when we come to that scene where he pops the cast off his arm, it was like, oh, that's clever.
I like that too. Oh, that is funny. Yeah, that is solid, isn't it?
I was highly amused by that. And this was another one with good music usage.
Yep.
I especially liked when Dom is like sawing off his shotgun and all that, and they've got this snippet of, and it just happens that I know the song. It's the Deftones' Tempest.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, what a perfect song for that moment.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of other really well placed bits of music throughout there that I was like, wow, okay, I like that.
Right.
The rest of the, I mean, for the actual you know, plot itself, I was like, this is dumb.
Right.
This is just really stupid.
It's not even consistent. I mean, you know, like there's holes you could, I mean, it doesn't make sense half the time. I mean,
no, I mean, all the different plot strands. So yeah, the introduction of Mr. Nobody.
Yeah.
And Jaconda, and I was like, what
why, if their big goal is to get Shaw, and Shaw just shows up in Abu Dhabi like shooting, what, I mean, why are they running away from? Shouldn't they just shoot him dead right there? And like, why? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Like, there's a lot of little things like that. Like, what, you know, why do they have to go on this big mission to find him? He's right there, you know.
Yeah,
there were a lot of things like that, you know.
Yeah, this is just we need a movie, so we got to do this. I did like the party in Abu Dhabi. So and in particular, and it's the thing that I like in a lot. I mean, I liked it back in the Schwarzenegger movie. I think it was True Lies. I love when you've got your tech guy someplace else having witty banter with.
Sure.
So
Yes.
I loved that, and Tyrese out there, grabbing the girl, and he's ad libbing, or was that not Teresa, the other one, but the
Yes.
the whole ad libbing with the
Ludicrous.
birthday. It's her birthday, and it's not. It's
Right. Well, no,
that's
that is Tyrese
that
who's
is Tyrese.
who's doing the birthday bit. But yes,
Yes.
you've got Ludacris on the other side going, "Oh, don't tell me he's
Don't, yeah, not the birthday. No. And I actually really loved that scene. Um, and the Ronda Rousey bit, I was like, I was in, I was impressed that they found somebody, that they brought her in to do that fight
That's
scene.
just it. They could get almost anybody they wanted at that point. And I mean, within reason. There was so many people who wanted to be part of these movies by this point. I mean, it really plays. There's a lot of excess in this film. It seems like
Yeah.
you just you're like, wait, they also have Kurt Russell in this thing. He showed, you're like, Jesus, how many more people can they find for this thing?
They actually did a good job managing an ensemble cast
They do.
that big.
No, you're right. Actually, I think something like this shows the way to something like Avengers Endgame, where, because how can you have 15 characters that you can care about? Let me ask you this, though, since you brought up the Abu Dhabi party scene. Do we need to talk about the general kind of sexist objectification in Fast and the Furious films? Because the crowd scenes and the scene of like Natalie Emmanuel on the beach in Abu Dhabi coming out in the bikini in the slow motion, it almost plays like a lot of this plays like mid 90s hip hop videos and has music to go with it. And I don't know. I mean, isn't that a little cringe? I mean, what was your feeling when you were watching this kind of thing? Did you care? Was it
Well,
nothing?
for me, even more than the party, well, I mean, it is the party, but while I thought it was cool that they brought Ronda Rousey out, my first thought was, oh, you brought out so you can have a girl fight,
Yeah,
because everybody
sure,
knows how
of course.
popular, scantily clad women fighting are in movies.
Sure.
So that was where I saw it. I have, I think, less of a problem than many people do in terms of looking at movies within their time.
Okay.
So when I'm looking at at that one, I'm thinking about the time that it came out, and I'm like, we hadn't really gotten fully into, Me Too and really looking at representation at that
Yeah.
point. It's just like, I know there are a lot of people who look back at all, all the John Hughes films of the 80s and are like, oh, they're so cringy.
Right.
And I'm like, but they weren't then. And we have to,
no, you're right.
keep that in mind.
Although, yeah, I mean, for example, Iron Man 2008, there's this scene where like Tony Stark presses a button, Robert Downey Jr., and like they're on a plane and the stewardesses come out and party and are acting all scantily clad. I don't think, though, that the Avengers films would have done that a few years later. I think that really marks that film as kind of 2000s, first decade. I think by the time of 2015, I don't know. I think Fast and Furious was one of the few franchises still doing that. It seemed my point is, I feel like you're right, but it was getting a little cringier by that point. Go ahead.
The other thing that I think we have to keep in mind, though, is the particular life and the particular lifestyle that they were reflecting. And if you look at a lot of the reality TV from that time, or
yeah, sure.
There was one or two different canceled. They didn't last very long at all. Shows about these rich, beautiful young people.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can actually still see a lot of it on Instagram.
Sure.
But the children, and now I think we're seeing it with the children of the oligarchs, who are often many of these people who do, in fact, spend their time partying on yachts and in these luxury high rises, and they are running around scantily dressed like that. The women are dressed like that at parties. It is, in fact, in its own interesting way, a window into a lifestyle that we're also kind of looking at it and going, no, that's not okay.
Right.
But they're living by a whole different set of values than we are.
Yeah. That's so true.
And so, I mean, it works as fantasy on a level for us, but at the same time, it is actually reality.
Right. You know, it's funny when you mentioned the hospital collapsing, it reminded me of a similar scene in The Dark Knight, you know, when Heath Ledger blows up the hospital.
Yeah.
And I thought actually, you know, it's weird to connect this film to that one because, you know, Paul Walker's death probably gave the film a certain gravitas that helped enable this franchise's record box office, much as Heath Ledger's
Yeah.
death had done for The Dark Knight. You wouldn't think that those movies would have those two connections. I wanted to ask you about the way that Dom says it's never goodbye at the end. I mean, I don't know if that was in the original script. They don't want us to know that, but it's such an interesting thing to say because it would have played so differently if Walker were still alive. It would have been this sort of wink and a nod as if Paul Walker had already said no to the next film, but hey, we bet he comes back later. Arguably, It's Never Goodbye could, in fact, still refer to the franchise's computer augmented ability to bring back Brian at some point. They can if they want. But do you think it plays that way, Nikole? I actually think it plays pretty smart. I think it plays as a nice wrap up to Paul. You know what it actually reminds me of? It reminds me of Rose, played by Kate Winslet, saying, "I'll never let go," right when she lets go of Jack's hand to send him to his watery grave, because it's embracing a contradiction. It's never goodbye, but we know it is, you know, so it's embracing a contradiction even while it's also understanding that death is final, you know. And I for me, it plays. Did you feel it played when you were watching it?
I think I saw it more as It's Never Goodbye because what he created, that family that they have formed, endures.
That's a great point. You know what? I think you've probably answered my next question just now, because I was going to say, since you had said, Nikole, that all of these films are trying to get us to think about something. What was this movie trying to get us to think about? Do you think family, cars, or I don't know?
Cars don't fly.
Cars don't fly. Yeah, maybe that's really what we were supposed to get from this. I don't know.
I remember reading something at some point that said that you know that the franchise in general wanted you to focus on family elements.
Yes.
That just never really resonated well with me. Honestly, part of what I think I really liked about Furious 7 was it really didn't make me think about much of anything at all other than, damn, that's cool. Look at what they did. But for me, it was really 2 hours of just absolute escapism,
right,
and vicarious vengeance getting.
Yeah.
So that may not have been, in fact, probably not at all what they were after, but that's where it landed for me.
Okay. I'm all right with that. I'm okay with that.
And
go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, the only thing, and it's funny because as you talked about that it was the first big multi-ethnic cast, and that was actually one of the things that I was looking at when I was looking at, and I also, not just the big multi-ethnic cast, but that the two women of color played such a prominent. They were very important to the story. In this case, they weren't just accessories.
Thank you. Well said. Yeah. No, I think the thing is that we're so used to seeing multi-ethnic, pan-ethnic groups when we watch sports, for example, you know, and then so it's weird to not have it in Hollywood. I mean, I'm so glad Wesley Morris pointed that out, that certainly in 2011, he was absolutely right to say that other than the Fast and the Furious films, where the hell was that, you know? Yeah. And I think it's gotten a little better now, thanks to people like Morris, thanks to this Fast and Furious franchise. It's improved. It has. But, you know, it took a while. I mean, and it took a lot longer than it should have. I'm thinking about how in 2015, this was also the year of the second Avengers film, Avengers Age of Ultron, which ended. The last shot has like finally a kind of an ethnic version of the Avengers, if you will. Like
Yeah.
finally it's like Falcon and like the Don Cheadle character, the War Machine, you know, and like Scarlet Witch has a good role, and so it's fun. But it took that long, you know, and I'm just like, I mean, okay, all right, finally. So we're 7 years into the Obama 8 year period, and we finally got this. Kind of like having to wait for Hamilton almost. I mean, you know, it took this long. But anyway, I mean, but at least you do have it, and I think I definitely think that anybody who considers themselves sort of a person who wants to watch films about diverse casts, they owe it to themselves to see at least one Fast and the Furious film. I think you have to do that. And, you know, why not see the one that was the highest grossing, best reviewed one? Why not? I mean, you can do that. I think this is fun. I like
beautiful cars. I mean,
right.
that was also for me, like when they get in there and they get that red car, that's just a beautiful. I I was sad to see that car tumble down.
You know,
Yeah.
are you talking about the scene where Dom like almost gets to the helicopter? Because I felt like when everybody on the street, you know, the crew was like, I actually thought they were kind of worried more about the car than Dom. They're like, oh no, not that car. I mean, I know at least one of them went Dom. I think it was Letty, but you know what I
Yeah.
mean. They were all like slack jawed, like, oh no, you know. And I think we thought that the car was just going to crash into the helicopter or something, because you know their
Yeah.
stunts usually work out, you know, so that was good, you know, in a sense. Yeah. Um, okay, well, I'm very aware of the time. You've been very patient, and so has this audience. So I just want to ask you, which is always my concluding question: did we learn anything today, Nikole, by putting these five films together, by looking at these five films, by saying, okay, here's some interesting films that came out at the second half of the Obama years? Did we learn anything by putting them together, Nikole? Or maybe we've learned nothing. That's okay if we learn nothing.
I think that it's always interesting when you look back at these films, through the lens of history. I
Yeah.
think that particularly looking at Selma and Fruitvale Station
Yep.
in light of and that their place in the Obama in administration in light of what was to come.
Yes.
Um, that I I think that the the hopefulness of that time was conveyed in those movies in an interesting way.
That
Um,
is so well said, especially since we have not been feeling the same hope. At least I haven't since Trump, then plus COVID. Yeah,
and
there's
so
a
I
really,
think that what I
yeah,
in looking back, that's what I in many ways I saw that I didn't necessarily grasp in that moment. At the
yes,
time, you did feel like, oh, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. But looking back, you see, oh, but there were all these strands of hopefulness and all these strands of we can learn from what's happened before. We can make things better. We can, and we because we didn't know what was yet to happen.
yeah, that's right. No, they're really. I'm really glad you say that. I think that I hadn't even noticed that myself. Where there's a kind of a, it's not like one thing you can point to, but there's a like a hum, like almost a subtext of kind of optimism about the American project, despite the fact that a BART cop has killed Oscar Grant and there was not justice for that BART cop, and despite the fact that what happened with Selma and that King was slain,
But
you know.
to go back to that first movie, there was the ending scene that by 2 o'clock that afternoon there was this huge crowd
Yeah.
standing there protesting.
Yes. Yes.
What happened? This is, I think that right there, that shows some of that optimism
Yep.
um, in a very interesting way. That just within a couple of hours, hundreds of people had turned out to say this is not the society that we want.
Yep.
This is not right. What has happened?
Yep. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think, as I said, I think it shows that sort of underlying thread of optimism and hopefulness that we had at that time.
You know what, Nikole? I think I'm giving you credit for the best ribbon that has ever been tied around any of these podcast episodes. Sorry, all my other guests, but Nikole just did it. So y'all gonna have to step back because she knocked this one out of the park. We're not accepting other submissions. Thank you. I'm not going to risk ruining this by dragging this out anymore. I'm going to thank you very sincerely, Nikole, for coming on this. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a blast.
Oh, it was a blast to have you, and I hope you grace us with your presence again on a future podcast. That would be awesome.
Thank you.
No, thank you. So now I'm just going to do my very quick outro where I say that actually this is crazy because this is the end. The amazing C list that I've been running. This is the 19th of 20 podcasts about this list. So next week is the 20th, and I'll be doing this one by myself for reasons I'll explain when I get there. So Nikole, you're our final guest of the season, and you rocked it, which was great. Thanks for crushing that. Next week we wrap up. And I'll also explain why I finish this list in the year I do in the sort of the pre-pandemic. Well, we'll talk about a bunch of things then. But anyway, so the final 5 films of the list are, just tune in next week, but the final 5 are Moana, Wonder Woman, Black Panther, which Nikole may have mentioned already, Crazy Rich Asians, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I hope you'll join me. Till then, save me some popcorn because there's always another movie to see.